Morning, everybody. Today is Wednesday, November 4th, 2020. We are, same as it ever was, going to continue to talk about muscle physiology in lecture. Again, we're doing very, very well on that portion. So again, like Monday, it'll be a relatively short lecture, which will give us a lot more time because we're a bit behind a little bit on our muscles where I would have liked to have been at this point. And I want to make sure we try to get through all of those before our exam. We have two more assignments due. Your unit review 11 is due on Monday, as is your muscle activity handout. And remember, that is graded for correctness. So make sure you're putting time and effort into it. Then we have the Wednesday holiday, and then we have our exam. So we're rapidly approaching that, about a week and a half out. So a lot of material to cover on that exam. So make sure you are studying well for that. All right, excellent. Any questions before we dive into the new material? All right, perfect. So we left off last time and we had been talking about a building back up. We've seen everything that happens at the sarcomere, and we've talked about everything that's going on with the proteins at that micromolecule level. And then last class, we spent a lot of time talking about how we deal with a single muscle cell and the different ways that we can change the amount of tension that is produced in a single muscle cell. And understanding those concepts is very, very important. But as we also mentioned yesterday or 2 days ago in class, when it comes to moving something through space, even something as simple as this pen that hardly weighs anything at all, I'm not going to rely on just one muscle cell to do that, right? So what we need to do is talk about how we work muscle cells together. And we do that now. So now we're at the level of multiple muscle cells. We do this with a organizing structure called a motor unit. A motor unit is basically comprised of two things: a somatic motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. Notice we have this great picture here from your textbook that has a fascicle in it, and then it has some neurons that communicate to it. Let's take a little bit of a simpler look at this. So let's say, for instance, I had a fascicle, and in that fascicle, it contained 6 muscle cells. There we go. As we know, we've talked a little bit about the anatomy of a neuron. We know neurons have a cell body, centrally located cell body. I don't want that to be red. Let's make it orange. A centrally located cell body. And as we also know, it has processes that come off of it. It has those small, elaborately branched processes that we call dendrites. And it has one long, unbranching axon. And that axon, as we know, terminates at a synaptic end bulb on a motor end plate, forming that structure that we call the neuromuscular junction. And that's huge. I don't need that to be huge. Okay, no new information or anything like that there. Other than to point out, because I'm not sure if I've done it yet before, that each muscle cell has one and only one neuromuscular junction. So only one neuron will communicate to a single muscle cell. So each muscle cell only gets information from a single somatic motor neuron. However, we know one other thing as well. As we've talked about, we have that somatic motor neuron that has the dendrites coming off of it, and that one axon. But as we know, that axon is singular and unbranched. But as we also talked about, when it gets near the end, it can branch, and that axon becomes axon terminals. So that axon becomes axon terminals. And so these axon terminals can allow a single somatic motor neuron to communicate with, oh, hold on, let's undo this. Cheat and come up here to this one. Multiple skeletal muscle cells. And let's draw one more. Oops. All right, that nerve got a little wonky, but you get the idea. So notice every single skeletal muscle cell is innervated by one and only one somatic motor neuron. But a somatic motor neuron can control multiple skeletal muscle cells, right? It's like the Army. In the Army, every soldier has one sergeant that they report to, but that one sergeant commands multiple soldiers. And it's the same thing here. So we have these three cells, cell A, cell B, and cell C. Three somatic motor neurons communicating with numerous skeletal muscle cells. So what I have here are three motor units. Now, there's one other important thing we need to know about a motor unit. We know their anatomy, their somatic motor neuron, and the skeletal muscle cells that they communicate with. But when a neuron, like for instance, B, fires its action potential, that action potential spreads to both skeletal muscle cells that it communicates with at the same time. And they both produce muscle action potentials at the same time, which means they're both going to move their regulatory proteins at the same time, which means that they're both going to contract at the same time. So with a motor unit, all the skeletal muscle cells contract and relax together. Now, so far so good. And for this next part, I need to grab my stack of pens. Because as you know, and I'm making this up totally, it requires one skeletal muscle cell to lift one pen. So if I wanted to flex this fascicle and lift a single pen, which of my motor units would I use to do that? Well, it requires one muscle cell to lift one pen. If only I had a somatic motor unit that controlled just one muscle cell, then that might be efficient to be able to lift it. Oh, look, and there you go. Motor unit A would allow me to lift this one pen. What if instead I wanted to lift two pens? What could I use then? B. What if I wanted to use three pens? Which motor unit could I use then? C. Excellent. What if I wanted to lift four? Could I lift four with this fascicle?
A and C?
Yeah. What if I used A and C together? Absolutely. Wouldn't that give me four muscle cells firing together that would allow me to lift that? And what if I wanted to lift five? Well, would I need all of them for five?
B and C?
B and C. What if I wanted to lift six? All of them, A, B, and C. And what if I wanted to lift seven?
You wouldn't be able to.
I wouldn't be able to, exactly. Not with this fascicle anyway. Absolutely. You get the idea. Yes, Haley, this is the idea of recruitment. One of the advantages of these motor units is they can be different sizes. And so notice from an efficiency standpoint, I can contract different numbers of muscle cells by using different numbers of motor units. And that can allow me within my muscle to change the amount of strength that I need to lift something. We're actually really, really good at this, right? That bag of groceries is on the table and you go to pick up that bag of groceries and you basically know how much it weighs. So you use an appropriate amount of weight to be, or strength to be able to lift that up, right? However, if you go to grab that bag and suddenly somebody's put 14 cans in it and you weren't anticipating that, do you necessarily at first use the right amount of weight to lift it up? No, you may drop it because it's heavier than you expected. Or if someone took 16 cans out of it, right, you grab it and it goes flying in the air because it's way lighter than you expected. But we're pretty good at being able to gauge and being able to, as Haley pointed out, recruit motor units to be able to do work for us. And so in its core, this is basically what it is. We have a somatic motor neuron and the muscle cells that it works with, and they all fire and contract and relax together. And we can add them together to change the amount of tension we produce within a single muscle organ, like the bicep brachia. Now, again, this is a very simple fascicle. A typical motor unit in the body has on average around 150 muscle fibers. Now, again, that's like saying the average height of a female is whatever the average height of female is, like 5'7" or something like that, whatever the average is, 5'4". All right. Again, we only have 18 people in the class right now. What are the chances that every single woman in this class is 5'4" tall? Probably not pretty good. In fact, with such a small group here today, nobody may be 5'4", right? Averages like this are not necessarily meaningful. It's a number. Does that mean you're really short, Haley? Is that what you're trying to say? Averages are useful numbers on occasion, but compact, I think, is the term that they use for that, right? But we want to vary them dramatically. If we're using precise movements, and again, remember we talked last time about that threading of the needle. When you're doing that type of precise manual dexterity type of activities, a motor unit may control as few as just 4 muscle cells. However, if you have to hit that 57-yard game-winning field goal with that big, huge, powerful kick, a single somatic motor neuron can control hundreds to thousands of muscle cells. Are you going to get a lot of precision if you have 1,000 muscle cells all firing together? No, but what you are going to get is a tremendous amount of strength. And so we have very different motor units. And notice how, like the drawing I did, and like this illustration here, right, they are intermixed within the fascicle. And in fact, with obviously something having hundreds and thousands of muscle cells in it. Oops, I don't have my chat, there you go. Often the motor unit, can control muscle cells from different fascicles. So all of the muscle cells for a motor unit do not have to be contained just in one fascicle. They can cross into multiple fascicles to be able to control it, but they are frequently intermixed. Now let's take a look at another example. Notice this example right here. Here we see again a fascicle similar to the one I drew, 3 motor units similar to the one I drew, and they are all intermingled like we talked about and so drew on my example as well. But unlike mine, how many blue cells are in that blue motor unit? Maxim, we'll talk about that. That's a great question. We will absolutely get to that, and we will explain that when we get to it. Okay, several, but come on, count them. How many blue cells are in that motor unit? 7, there you go. How many in the red motor unit? How many in the purple motor unit? I think 7. Yeah, like counting votes, exactly. Notice here in this case, they are very similar in size motor units. So why might there be an advantage? We see the advantage of why you would have different number of motor units, but why would you want to have motor units that are similar in size? They generate a similar amount of force, absolutely. And let's think about this. I think I talked about the example. I talked about my middle school experience back east, where when you got in trouble, you had to hold that textbook up until the principal got tired, right? Now, if my goal was to hold that textbook up, do I want to just continuously fire one motor unit again and again and again and again, just use that single motor unit and continue to fire it for as long as I possibly can to keep that textbook up? No, exactly, because it's going to fatigue much more rapidly. So by having similar size motor units, what I can do is I can alternate my firing of these motor units. Fire some and then let them rest. Fire the others and let them rest. Fire the third and let it rest. And by alternating through them, I can produce a more continuous tension, a more continuous force, but I can reduce the fatigue on the muscles. So yes, it is important to have different size motor units, but even similar size motor units can be beneficial because, as I mentioned, we are going to want to fire those asynchronously to allow for reduced fatigue. But Haley already hit on the big key important term that we need to talk about for these motor units, and this is the idea of recruitment. Here, once again, we have a cross section through a fascicle containing different muscle cells that are controlled by different motor units. And these motor units, like the ones that I drew on my illustration, differ in size. Not all motor units are equally excitable. It turns out the smallest motor units are the easiest ones to excite. They're the easiest ones to stimulate. So when I go to lift some unknown weight, the very first motor unit that is going to fire is going to be my smallest one. And notice that's what we see here in this illustration. All right, we have this fascicle that is at rest. We try to produce tension in it, and we just fire that first motor unit. And it just produces a small amount of weight. If that weight isn't enough, if that force, I should say, isn't enough to move the load, then what I am able to do is activate bigger and larger motor units to add their tension to it. So I go from a motor unit that has just 2 muscle cells in it to one that has 3 muscle cells. And now 5 muscle cells are firing, and I've increased my tension. And if that's not enough, I can recruit the next motor unit, adding even more, and the next motor unit adding even more, until finally I'm stimulating all the muscle cells within that fascicle at once, at which point I am producing the maximal amount of tension that I can produce in that muscle cell. Now, there is one problem on this, and this will get us back to what Maxim was asking us about. Remember, as we talked about, when I'm lifting my drink to my mouth, I'm able to do that smoothly. And remember, I'm able to do that smoothly because I'm firing my different muscle cells at an asynchronous rate. So all of them are firing. All of those myosins and actins are grabbing and pulling at different rates and different times, and it smooths it all out. However, if instead of holding my cup, I'm trying to hold up a couch, and as I'm trying to hold up that couch using that unfused tetanus we talked about, and when I'm holding up that couch, I'm firing all of my muscle cells at once. All of my muscle cells are firing and contracting at the same rate. And that is when you see that shaking of that unfused tetanus. So when you were talking about those weightlifters as they shake, as they're lifting the really, really heavy weights, it's because to lift such a heavy weight, they have to fire all the muscle cells at the same time. And you see that unfused tetanus. You see that wavering of the contraction, near the tension of near the maximal tension of each individual muscle cell. Because they're all firing at the same time, you actually see that unfused tetanus, and that's what causes that shaking. All right. So there you go. We see how we're able to recruit more. And again, here's the pretty picture that shows and illustrates what I was talking about before. Notice from the previous picture, we have that orange, we have that blue, we have that purple motor units, and we fire them asynchronously. And that reduces the fatigue, but it allows me to produce a sustained amount of tension that can allow me to hold that book up in hopes that my principal will get tired.
I have a question, sir.
Yes.
Is it possible that instead of hiring more muscles, that one muscle should be able to do a job? Like, as we see for like, it's like recruiting people in a company, like having, increasing the number of staff. It doesn't mean that they will produce effective work. Sometimes there is one person, they're producing more work than 2 or 3 people. So is it possible that one muscle do the job of 2 or 3 muscles?
So again, when it comes, I guess the real question comes down to what you mean by the terms of the job of. If you remember when we talked about it, the job of these muscle cells is to produce tension. Now, every single muscle cell is not going to be the same size. Remember, as we talked about, thicker, larger muscle cells have more myosin and more protein in them. So the larger the muscle cell, the more myosin, the more actin that they're going to have. It's going to be able to perform more power strokes. It's going to be able to produce more tension. So absolutely, different amounts of muscle cells will be able to produce different amounts of tension. Yes. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. Any others? All right, excellent. So now we know how to move a muscle through space. We know how to change the tension within a single muscle cell. We know how to vary the amount of tension within a muscle by using different size motor units. And as we produce that tension, we move our body through space. But it's more than just moving our body in space. When we contract a muscle, we do it to produce tension. And that tension produces different types of muscle activities. Again, unless you are listening to this lecture on a treadmill or standing at one of those standing desks while you're doing this, most of you are likely sitting down right now. And as we talked about before, if you were to take your finger and poke your leg, right, you would say that your leg is relaxed, that the muscle of your legs are relaxed. But remember, we also talked about if I then rolled a paraplegic into your room and you poked his leg would feel very different from your leg. Because while your leg is quote unquote relaxed, his muscle is flaccid. And that flaccidness comes because while your leg is quote unquote relaxed, that muscle does have a bit of what we call muscle tone. That muscle tone, as we talked about before, is very important in the function of our muscles, right? Every time I stop using my right arm, my humerus doesn't slowly slide out of the socket of my glenoid cavity, right? Because I have muscles that help to hold it in place so that even when my arm is relaxed, I have that muscle tone supporting the joint, stabilizing the blood vessels, providing protection in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So even when our muscle is quote unquote relaxed, it typically still has muscle tone, a state of a partial contraction. And even when we think of contracting the muscle, that contraction of the muscle can lead to different types of activities as well. Often when we talk about a contraction, we think of that moving of the body through space. We do that with what we call an isotonic contraction, right? This gets us a little into physics. You guys all, hopefully at this point, have learned my disdain for all things chemistry, right? Chemistry is a completely pointless field of study. Nothing good has ever come from it. But physics, on the other hand, is beautiful and elegant and important. And when we talk about physics, we talk about the relationship between the force we are producing and the load that is the resistance to that force. It's all in the name here, ISO. What does ISO mean? If you have an isosceles triangles, right, the two sides are the same. So ISO means same. What does tonic refer to? Anyone know?
Force.
Yeah, exactly. In this case, tonic, it refers to tension. So this is referring to a contraction that uses the same amount of tension. And that's really the key to the definition of this type of contraction. During an isotonic contraction, the tension that is produced, the force that is produced, let's use force just so we're using a different term, stays the same. If you think about it, that makes sense. If my goal is to lift this pen, as I'm lifting this pen, does this pen weigh less or more when it is here versus when it is here versus when it is here versus when it is here? The load doesn't change in this case. And because the load doesn't change, it's going to require the same force to move it throughout that entire location. I still have to use the same force here and the same force here and the same force here and so on and so forth as I'm lifting that pen. So the amount of force I produce stays the same. However, notice while I'm doing that, the length of my muscle changes. So as I am flexing my elbow to lift this pen, the muscle is changing shape, it's changing length, but the force that it is producing stays the same. So I reach into the back, the back of the car, the trunk of the car. I grab a bag of groceries and I lift that bag of groceries up so I can carry it into the house. Yes, we do have better leverage over ranges of motion because remember, as we talked about, the length of the muscle cell affects how much tension it uses. So absolutely, when the muscle is shorter or when the muscle is longer, we are not as efficient in producing our force, whereas in the middle part, we are more efficient, and that's because of the changing length of the muscle cells. And all you have to do is go to a gym to see that. Because you go to a gym, and we talked about the guys doing the curls for the girls, right? And you see the real studs who are just there with the weight, and all they're doing with it is doing this right here, right? They're not bringing it all the way up because that's hard. They're not doing a lot of starting because that's hard. But here in the middle, they can rock that out, right? Because it's much more efficient there because, again, of the length of the muscles. So the different lengths of the muscles, remember, change the amount of force that it can be produced. So it takes more effort to produce the same amount of force when the muscle's really stretched out or when the muscle's really short. All right. So we're changing the length of the muscle. The muscle changes length, but the force produced stays the same. I grab that bag of groceries and I lift it up. And of course, I always carry my groceries way out here, abducted. So I grab it and lift it up. I've changed the length of the muscle and I've produced the same amount of force. Of course, then I have to carry it into the house. Do I continue to lift the groceries the entire way that I carry them into the house? No, of course not. I lift them up and I hold the groceries there. And while I'm holding the groceries there, I carry them into the house with my arm out like this. And that is an example. I got to cheat and move this up here so it's out of the way. That is an example of what we call an isometric contraction. When I'm holding the bag of groceries out here, as I walk into the house, Notice my contraction is isometric. Iso still refers to same. And in this case, what does metric refer to?
Distance.
Length. Yeah, absolutely. Length, distance. So the muscle stays the same length, right? During an isometric contraction, let's use the same wording. So during isometric contraction, the length of the muscle stays the same. However, as I'm holding that bag of groceries way out here, getting ready to walk into the house, my wife comes and puts 2 more bags of groceries onto my arm. What happens when that occurs? So I'm holding my bag of groceries and my wife puts 2 more bags of groceries onto my arm. What happens?
More tension, more force on your hand.
Right. Maxim, does it go down? Right? Does the arm drop? No, because if it does that, she wins, right? I can't let her win. So instead, when she puts more weight on there, I produce more tension so that it stays the same, right? If my kids, on the other hand, take pity on me and take one of the bags off, does my arm suddenly go flying into space? No, I reduce the amount of tension. So notice in this type of contraction, the length stays the same, but the force produced can change. Now, again, hopefully none of you are carrying your groceries in with your arms abducted, but there is a whole series of isometric contraction, isometric exercises that people do to stay fit, right? One of those things that they do is you grab your arms and you pull, or you take your hands and you push in the middle, right? If I push just a little bit, or if I push a whole lot, right, I'm changing the amount of force that is being produced. And as a result of that, my muscles are not changing shape. So if I push a whole lot, or if I push just a little bit, the muscle is staying the same length and it does not change. This is the definitions of these, but we can also kind of simplify this a little bit as well. If you think about it, with our isotonic contraction, our muscle changes length. And the reason for that is with an isotonic contraction, the force and the load are never equal. So basically, either the force is greater than the load, or, oops, that's not an or the force is less than the load. Conversely, with an isometric contraction, the muscle never changes length. And the reason the muscle never changes length is because the force and the load are always equal. So with an isometric contraction, force always equals load. So we get a little physics this morning. All right. Questions on that? All right. We need to add one more piece to this puzzle. And it comes back to this concept right here. Notice with an isotonic contraction, either the force can be greater than the load or the force can be less than the load. This is not a new concept. This is not something you haven't heard of before. You just haven't thought of it in those ways. Because let's go back to those boys doing the curls for the girls in the gym. They've got that nice big weight and they're flexing to bring that weight up. And once they bring that weight up, do they just relax the arm and let the weight fall back down? Okay, well, there are some guys in the gym who do that. But is that what you're supposed to do when you're lifting that weight? No. When you lift it up in a controlled manner, and you also lower it in a controlled manner. Try this for yourself. Grab a pen and do this. Lift this up, right? And obviously when you lift it up, what muscle are you using, right? Poke your arm. What muscle has the tension in it when you are lifting that pen?
Biceps.
Yeah, it's the biceps brachia, absolutely. Now lower it. As you lower it, notice you're extending the elbow, but is the tension in your tricep while you do that? While
No.
you're lowering
No.
it in a controlled fashion? No, the tension is actually in the bicep brachia. When you are doing that controlled release of it, the tension is actually in the bicep brachia. And the reason for this is there are actually two types of isotonic contractions.
Active and passive.
Nope, not a bad guess. They are concentric and eccentric. With a concentric contraction, and now we can use some of the vocabulary we've talked about. In this case, the force you are producing is greater than the load. So force is greater than the load. With that concentric contraction, and again, we'll use just artificial numbers. Let's say it takes 10 of whatever the force units are that we're using to lift this, because it is 10. And so we put 11 into the arm. I put 11 force units into my arm, and that moves the 10-pound load. All right, I'm putting more force into it than the load is, and I'm able to lift it up. As I do that, when I do this contraction, the muscle gets shorter. However, when I drop that weight, if I drop the weight, I make it 0 and it just falls, but I don't want it to just fall. So instead, in my bicep brachia, I make my force unit 9. 9 cannot hold up 10. So what happens is it slowly descends because I'm putting less force into my muscle than the weight itself. So in that case, we have what we call an eccentric contraction. With the eccentric contraction, the force that we are generating is less than the load. That force is less than the load. And as a result of that, the muscle gets longer. Why would you use these eccentric contractions?
Does it
Put
mean
things down?
Yeah, absolutely, to put things down, right? If instead of that 15-pound weight you guys keep talking about, right, that everybody drops, what if what I've lifted to pick up was my bag of groceries that had eggs inside of it? When I get to the kitchen table, do I just relax my bicep brachia and let that bag with the eggs fall to the table? No, I want to put it down in a controlled fashion, right? The other place that you see this is, for instance, when you're walking downstairs. If you think about what happens to your leg when you are walking downstairs, as you are walking down the stairs, what actually happens is your quadricep muscles actually elongate as you're walking down the stairs. Back in ancient times, you used to be able to fly on a plane, and one of the places you used to be able to go was New York City. And in really ancient times, one of the things you used to do when you were in New York City was go to the top of the Statue of Liberty. Now, technically, you still can. So if you are planning on going to New York anytime soon, what you need to do well in advance is contact them to make reservations to be able to get inside and actually go up to the top. It is an amazing experience if you haven't done it, and I highly recommend it. The only problem is the only way to get to the top is this very tight spiral staircase that goes up. There's no elevator that goes up to the head of the Statue of Liberty. So you have to walk up something like 782 stairs or whatever it is. And the problem with walking up 782 stairs is when you're done, you have to walk down 782 stairs. Not surprisingly, the next day when you wake up in the morning, your quadriceps are going to be really, really sore. And guess what? They're not going to be sore from going up the stairs. They're going to be sore from coming down it. An eccentric contraction is where the muscle contracts at less than the load, and that causes the muscle to lengthen. And it is a very impactful, very forceful type of contraction that is much more fatiguing on the muscle. Now, we've learned the microscopic anatomy of how a muscle contracts. So how is it when we know the myosin head grabs and pulls and the sarcomere gets shorter, how can the muscle lengthen when we're contracting it? And again, I'll have to work on my analogies, but I'll stick with the ones that I have in the classroom. We go back to the example of all of us playing tug of war. Me on one side and all of you on the other. I'm going to be on my side grabbing and pulling that rope, just like a myosin head. I'm going to reach out, I'm going to grab, I'm going to power stroke, I'm going to let go. And I'm going to be grabbing and pulling on my end of the rope. Grab and pull, grab and pull. But if I have all 18 of you on the other side and all 18 of you are grabbing and pulling at the same time, am I going to be winning if we're playing tug of war? No. So I'm going to grab, I'm going to perform my power stroke, and then you guys are going to yank the rope away from me. And as you yank the rope, that's going to extend my arm, or my arm's going to have to let go of the rope, and I'm going to get that rope burn as you guys are pulling the rope away from me. So I'm still grabbing and pulling, but you guys are still pulling the rope away from me. You can see why it's much more impactful and much more damaging and much more fatiguing for the muscle. So that's why when you're doing those curls for the girls, it is so important to not just lift it in a controlled fashion, but also lower it in that controlled fashion, because actually the lowering of that weight in the controlled fashion is much more impactful and is going to have a much bigger effect on increasing your strength and muscle mass as a result of that. Right? So it isn't just about using the most weight as possible, but using the weight that you're doing in a controlled fashion that is going to maximize your workout. All right. Questions on that? All right, excellent. All right, so now we've learned how to produce tension. Now we've learned how to change the amount of tension we've produced. Now we've even learned how to move our body through space. The last big concept we've got to cover then is to talk about how we sustain a contraction, how we maintain that contraction, all right? As we've talked about, there are really two main resources that must be inside of the muscle cell for the muscle cell to be able to contract. What are the two big resources that we must have in the muscle cell for a contraction to take place?
Calcium and ATP.
Calcium and ATP. Now, remember, as we've talked about with the calcium, is calcium used up by the activity of the muscle cell?
Not very much.
No. It just binds to the troponin and then lets go. Then binds again. Right. Our limiting factor of calcium is how much is available, not because it gets used up, but because it gets pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or it gets pumped out of the cell. So it is one of the limiting resources that we have, but not because it's used up. But what about ATP? ATP is definitely used up by the contractile cycle. Right? As we know, our myosin head splits it into ADP and phosphate. So ATP is definitely a limited resource that does get used up. And so how much ATP we have is going to play an important role on determining how long we can contract that muscle for. So if I have a muscle that is sitting here in its relaxed state, and I decide to contract that muscle, when I first contract that muscle, we are going to start to need to use ATP. And where is the ATP going to come from when I very first start to contract that muscle cell?
The muscle. From the muscle?
Yeah, well, if you think about it, the muscle, when it's in its relaxed state, do you think it has ATP inside the muscle cell?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. As we know, ATP does more than cause the muscle to contract. It's used for pumps. It's used for all sorts of things, right? It has some spending money in its pocket. All right. It has some free floating cash, 20 bucks folded up, crumpled up into his front pocket. Readily available ATP just stored in our muscle cell. Our muscle cell, when it is in a relaxed state, is using some ATP, not a lot. So it has stored ATP in it. And so when our muscle starts to contract, it's going to use that spending cash it has on it. Now, do you walk around with thousands of dollars in your pocket when you're at the mall? No, probably not. So do you think our muscle cell has millions upon millions of ATP just sitting around inside of it? No, because as we said, ATP is used for pumps. It's used for all sorts of other resources. So while there is some ATP stored in the cell already, it is somewhat limited. There isn't a massive amount of it. And in fact, if we were to contract a muscle just using the stored ATP that is inside of it, that muscle contraction would only last for about 2 to 10 seconds. Is that how long you're able to contract your muscles for? 2 to 10 seconds?
How long they run a 100-meter.
That is true. It is useful for something along those lines, absolutely. Although we'll talk about that in just a minute. That is a great point. But every contraction that you make, is it 10 seconds or less? No, absolutely not. So just like when you're walking around at the mall, you may have 40 bucks cash in your pocket, but how many people go to the mall and only get to spend 40 bucks? Right? Typically, we need more than that. And so luckily, we have other sources. None of us have that readily available $1,000 sitting in our pocket in cash, but hopefully you got that $1,000 in your bank account. And luckily, you have that bank card that allows you to access that, right? This is energy. This is money that you have. You've earned. You already have it. You own it. But it's a little bit harder to get to. Not impossible, but a little bit harder to get to. And that's what creatine phosphate is. Creatine phosphate is a more stable energy molecule. Oops, you're right. It is a stable energy molecule, but it's not as much in demand as ATP, so we can have it more readily laying around. What happens is when the cell is at rest, we have this molecule, and I need to change the size of this now. This molecule called creatine. And at rest, what happens is that creatine, well, no, actually, Haley, creatine is, that creatine monohydrate that people take is related to this. Because when a muscle is at rest, what happens is creatine will find one of those free-floating ATPs that is hanging out inside of the cell. And when it does that, it rips one of the phosphates off of it. It splits the ATP, and it becomes creatine phosphate. And that creatine phosphate, oops, hope if I spell phosphate right. And then, of course, what's left from that is an ADP. I think I can make that a little bigger. There we go. So if you think about it, when the body is at rest, when the muscle is at rest, there is lots of ATP available, as we just talked about. And so what happens is this equation goes in this direction. Because there's lots of ATP, that creatine phosphate can rip off that ATP. And unlike most things, when we talk about things ripping off a phosphate, it uses the energy. Instead, what happens here is our creatine phosphate just stores the energy. It doesn't actually use it. So it stores the energy, it doesn't actually use it. So now our cell is contracting. When our cell is contracting, as we know, there is going to be a large amount of ADP because our myosin heads are splitting that ATP. Our myosin head is splitting that ATP and making lots of ADP. And when that occurs, it causes the reaction to reverse. When the muscle cell is contracting, what ends up happening is now there is lots of ADP. And so what happens is it drives the reaction back in the other direction. What happens is the creatine phosphate will give its phosphate back to the ADP. CP gives the phosphate to the ADP and makes ATP. So we have some readily available energy. So that is exactly as you mentioned. A bodybuilder then who takes a creatine supplement is trying to get more of this creatine into their muscle cells so that they're able to store more energy in their muscle cells so that they can have more readily available ATP to be able to produce more powerful contractions for a longer period of time, get a bigger workout. Right? Like I said, this is like having that money in the bank. You have this money in your savings account and it's there ready for you when you need it. So when you need it, you can take that money out of your savings account to buy whatever it is you need to buy. And there's typically about 3 times as much creatine phosphate as there is ATP. So it is able to rapidly replenish the ATP. Let's go ahead and erase all this. And so in this case, we're able to, using that stored energy from the creatine phosphate, produce a contraction that can last anywhere from 15 to 20 seconds. So we get a much, much longer contraction with this stored energy. But notice, and this is kind of going back to what someone was mentioning before, we're not making new energy at this point. This is just stored energy that is already ready available in your cell. Like I said, you go shopping, you have cash in your pocket, you have cash in your savings account. The problem is if you spend a weekend at the mall, you're going to use up both of those. And now what do you got to do? Now you got to get a job, right? Because now it's time to make more money. You've used up your saved money. You've used up the readily available money. Now you need to make more money or get a stimulus check. And again, I can bet you dollars to donuts now that it looks like the Republicans are keeping the Senate and Likely Trump is going to be in there. Good luck getting that stimulus check. All right. So no, you got to go out and get a job. So we need to be able to make money. Luckily, we know how to make money, or in this case, know how to make ATP. Right? Where do we make ATP again?
Muscles.
Well, okay, but in a cell, what if only we learned the organelles that are responsible for making ATP?
Yeah.
Mitochondria.
Lever.
Mitochondria, absolutely. The mitochondria are the organelles, absolutely. If you remember, we talked about in our mitochondria, we have that process that we called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, remember, is where we completely break down sugar. Of course, to completely break down that sugar, we need oxygen. And that gives us lots of energy. And we use that energy to make ATP. But remember, we also talked about there are two waste products. What are the two waste products that are occur in this cellular respiration? Carbon dioxide. And what's the other waste? If you're not sure, you could always just look at the picture. The picture shows it. All right. Remember, when all else fails, cheat. Water. There you go. Excellent. Water. There you go. All right. Cellular respiration happening at the mitochondria. Remember, this is the whole reason you do this. Right? You're taking in the oxygen to give it to your cells. You're getting rid of that waste product, the carbon dioxide. This cellular respiration is what we call aerobic respiration because it uses oxygen. Right. A process called the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. We didn't talk about it when we were talking about the cells, and we're not going to talk about it here either. But in this fashion, we are able to break down fuels like glucose, but also like fatty acids and even amino acids in extreme cases. And as a result of this process, one single glucose can produce us anywhere between 34 and 36 ATP. It is incredibly efficient at completely breaking down that glucose. Completely breaks down that glucose with oxygen, and it is incredibly efficient. Right? In this case, we can make energy to be able to sustain activities for hours. Right? How long can you stand for? Not a trick question. How long can you stand for? Hours, absolutely, right? Absolutely. A whole 12-hour shift if you need to, right? And remember, everything is walking distance if you have the time, right? What this allows us to do is to be very efficient at producing ATP. And it can allow us to sustain moderate muscle activity for hours. For hours, absolutely. Is there a downside to this process? Yeah, there's really two. One is that it requires oxygen. So obviously we need to be able to get that oxygen to it. Yeah, true, it drains resources. But remember, if you're walking, you can always eat a sandwich while you walk, That's not too bad. So we can replace those. And as long as we keep breathing, we can get it. But it does require oxygen. That is one of the challenges to this process. But the other challenge to this, if there is a downside to this process, it is that it is relatively slow. As I mentioned, you can stand for hours. You can walk for hours. But as Laura pointed out, how long can you sprint for? Can you sprint for hours? No, absolutely not. So if we are using a muscle at its peak efficiency, if we are maximizing the work that a muscle does, is this slow process going to be able to provide enough energy for it? No, unfortunately, it only can provide about a third of the energy needed for maximal effort. So while this is a very efficient way of making energy, we get lots of ATP, providing hours of moderate activity, it cannot help us when we are sprinting. Yeah, it can help you with the marathon, right? Aerobic respiration is going to be useful for that, but it isn't going to help you for that 200-yard dash. For that use of the muscle at peak intensity, we need a quick and dirty way to make ATP to be able to keep up with that. And lucky for us, we do have a second way of making energy. And that second way of making energy is anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is making ATP without oxygen. Now, I actually want to cheat and go back a picture first real quick. Notice what happens here. Notice here, if you look at our illustration, let me move this out of the way so we can see this more clearly. We have our glucose, and the first step in this process is to take this one glucose and split the glucose. When we split the glucose, we get two pyruvates, or what is also known as pyruvic acids. And when we do that, that pyruvic acid is then what enters into the mitochondria. But it can only enter into the mitochondria if you have enough oxygen. So with the oxygen, that pyruvic acid, that pyruvate, can enter into the mitochondria and be completely broken down. But notice, splitting the glucose didn't require oxygen. And that's the key to anaerobic respiration. In anaerobic respiration, we do the process of glycolysis. Glyco, sugar, lys, split. So this is that splitting of the glucose. It turns out when you split the glucose to produce those two pyruvates, those two pyruvic acids, you actually get 2 ATP from that process. So notice, without oxygen, we still can take one glucose and use it to make ATP. But now we're only making 2 ATP. You just went from that hybrid that's getting 36 miles to a gallon to that Hummer that is getting 2 miles, 2 miles to the gallon. This is much less efficient. Right? If you drive a Hummer, what does that Hummer need? It needs a huge gas tank, absolutely. Because if you only had a 6-gallon tank in that Hummer, you wouldn't be able to make it from gas station to gas station. You wouldn't be able to get anywhere with that. It is very inefficient at using its gasoline. All right, and it's the same thing here. if we don't have oxygen, we can make ATP, but it is much less efficient. And so what happens is two things. We use up our fuel very quickly. But here's the other problem. The other problem is in that pyruvates. Those two pyruvates are pyruvic acids. With oxygen, enter the mitochondria and are broken down completely. But those same two pyruvates without oxygen are converted into lactic acid. And lactic acid, as I'm sure you know, is a toxin. And that lactic acid is toxic to the cell. It damages to the cell. And that lactic acid is one of the main factors that leads to fatigue. Yep. So the good news is we have a quick and easy way to make ATP to be able to produce some type of maximal intensity like a sprint, but we can't maintain that sprint for a long period of time. Because it uses up the fuel too quickly and because it produces a toxin that leads to fatigue in the muscle cell. All right. Questions on that? So notice when it comes time to contract our muscle, 4 ways to get the energy that we need. 2 of them are stored energy sources, ATP and the creatine phosphate. And 2 of them are ways that which we can make new ATP, aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So 4 different sources for making ATP to do the activities that we need to do. So if you need to sprint, if I tell you got to run a 200-yard sprint, all right, you're going to quickly use up the ATP, quickly use up the creatine phosphate. You're going to make ATP aerobically, but is that going to be enough to meet all the needs of that sprint across the yard? No. So then you're going to need to use that anaerobic respiration as well. So we can use all of these. There you go. Or you can just pass the baton to Usain Bolt. Exactly. So we have all 4 of these methods for making the energy necessary. So if I'm going to maximally contract a muscle, these are the things that I'm going to use to be able to do that. 2 types of stored energy, 2 ways to make energy. All right. Questions on that? All right. That is a good stopping point. Let's go ahead and take our first break. And then we'll talk about fatigue and what happens with that as we come back from that. All right, let's say it's 9:10, so let's take a 15-minute break. That means coming back and we will restart at 9:25. And I will start the recording at that point. All righty, see you guys in 15 minutes. Back to it. So, any questions on how we get the energy necessary for a contraction before we move forward? All right, so as we hinted at the end of that section is that part of the problem of vigorously exercising or vigorously using the muscles is that it leads to the condition that we call muscle fatigue. And I know we talked about this a little bit before, so I want to make sure to emphasize this with you guys now. Fatigue is not the same thing as failure. Muscle fatigue is when the muscle cannot perform at the required level of activity. Right? If you are a baseball pitcher who normally throws the ball 100 miles an hour, and in the 7th inning, you were only throwing the ball 95 miles an hour, throwing a baseball 95 miles an hour is still incredibly efficient. I mean, impressive. But it's not at the level that you required. You were able to do 100 before, and now you can't do 100 anymore. And so that muscle is considered fatigue. So fatigue does not equal failure. Fatigue just means that you can't perform at the required level. Now, what do you think some of the factors? Now, one of the things I will say is the complete full mechanism of what causes muscle fatigue is not completely understood. But we do know many of the factors that contribute to it. So what do you guys think some of the factors that contribute to muscle fatigue might be?
Glucose stores have been used up.
Absolutely. So absolutely, we need a loss of our resources to make ATP. Obviously, one of the big ones of that is indeed our glucose. But what was the other thing that we needed to make ATP efficiently? Oxygen, absolutely. So we could lose oxygen resources as well. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, that's a good one. Remember, we talked about the lactic acid. The lactic acid affects muscle cells in a couple of ways. First, as I mentioned, it is a toxin, so it can be damaging to the muscle cell. But it's also an acid. And obviously, if you are putting an acid inside of the cell, that acid inside of the cell is going to change the pH of the cell. And I think we talked about this earlier, but now is a good point to mention it again. Why might a change in pH affect a muscle cell in particular?
Causes acidosis.
Okay, but what does that mean? You're right. It does mean that the cell becomes more acidic on the inside, but while all cells have the potential to become acidotic, why would it be more significant that a muscle cell becomes acidic? There you go. Absolutely. Remember, our muscle cells are chock filled with proteins. And what are proteins really sensitive to? pH changes, right? So that change in pH modifies the proteins. And if we modify the proteins, changes the shape of the proteins, they can become less efficient. Remember, one of the key proteins that we talked about that is really sensitive to pH changes is troponin. Troponin in particular is highly, highly sensitive to pH changes. And so what happens is it changes its shape and it makes it a little harder for the calcium to bind to it. If calcium can't bind as easily to the troponin, then fewer troponins are going to change their shape. If fewer troponins change their shape, fewer tropomycins get moved. If fewer tropomycins get moved, fewer myosin heads can grab and pull, and suddenly your muscle is a little weaker than it was before. Absolutely. So that change in the pH can affect the proteins. What else is are proteins really sensitive to?
Sure.
Temperature changes. Remember, as we talked about, myosin heads are motors. Motors, as we talked about, convert chemical energy into mechanical energy. Absolutely. And as we know, heat denatures proteins, right? Motors convert chemical energy into mechanical energy, but they're not 100% efficient, right? Some of the energy is lost in the form of heat. In fact, remember we said some muscle cells, as much as 75% of the energy can be lost in the form of heat. That's really, really good for helping to maintain your body temperature. After all, when you get cold, one of the things that you do is you shiver, because we can generate a lot of heat that way. But that heat can change the proteins and can change the efficiency of our muscle cell. Excellent. What else do you think could affect our muscles? Make them less efficient?
Damage to the muscle cell.
Excellent. That's a great one. Damage to the muscle cell, or really more importantly to the myofilaments. Those myosin heads grabbing and pulling produce a force. And that force can be a very dramatic on its effect of the cells, right? We can get a misalignment of the proteins, right? If the myosin and actin can't efficiently form, or our sarcomere gets broken, or the Z disc gets broken or something like that, we break off myosin heads. This misalignment, this breaking of the proteins, again, makes the muscle less efficient, right? Again, we are not hurting the muscle when this occurs, this damage. This is a normal part of the process. It is impactful, and things get broken when you're playing with them. That's what happens, right? But you know this. You haven't thought of it in those terms, but you know it, because when you have that workout regime, do you do arms on Monday and then turn around and do arms on Tuesday? Mix it up with arms on Wednesday, more arms on Thursday, and finish the week with arms on Friday? Is that your workout regime? No, absolutely not. You do arms on Monday and then legs on Tuesday. Why aren't you using your arms on Tuesday? Because they're sore, right? Part of that soreness is the inflammation, is the broken, the damage. And as we talked about, we repair it by making more proteins. We repair the proteins and make more proteins. That makes the muscle cell bigger. That makes the muscle cell stronger. That's how we add strength. Right? So we're not talking about tearing a muscle or tearing a tendon. We are talking about microscopic misalignments and breaks in the proteins of those myofilaments that cause muscle fatigue, but also allow the muscle cell to repair and to grow and get stronger. So again, we're not talking about injury. This is not an injury this occurs. This is that soreness from use because of that misalignment and the breaking of the proteins. Remember also, our muscle contracts because the myosin is pulling on the actin, because the regulatory proteins have been pulled out of the way, because calcium has, well, we'll talk about injury in a second. Calcium has been released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And what caused calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum? How do we get calcium to come out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum? Opening those voltage gated channels. And what do we need to open those voltage gated channels?
Potential to depolarize it.
Yeah, we need a muscle action potential. Absolutely. We need that muscle action potential. And that muscle action potential, acetylcholine opens that chemically gated cation channel, and cations flow. Sodium comes in, potassium goes out. So could things like, as we have massive amount of ions moving into and out of the cell, can an imbalance in our ion concentrations affect the function of a cell? Yeah, absolutely. So great question. Typically, when you take something like a Gatorade that has electrolytes in it, those are typically to replace ones that are lost via sweating. When we sweat, it isn't just water that we're losing, but we're losing electrolytes that way. So it's about maintaining ionic imbalance, or reestablishing our ionic balance at a macro level, right? Replacing the waters, replacing the electrolytes that are lost through sweat. This here, we're looking at a cellular level. So we're looking at differences in sodium inside or outside of the cell, or potassium inside or outside of the cell, things that way. So this is more at the cellular level. And so something like taking that Gatorade isn't going to necessarily help with that. It's more going to be about using pumps and things like that to put the ions back where they belong. But having those ionic imbalances, again, remember, we have to have sodium come in to get it to reach threshold to get that muscle action potential. If we can't get sodium to come in as much because of an ionic imbalance, it's going to be harder to get a muscle action potential. And if it's harder to get a muscle action potential, it's going to be harder to release that calcium, harder to get the muscle to contract. All of these things are absolutely great, super important things that affect muscle fatigue. But there's really one more really interesting factor. Anybody here a distance runner? Anyone in here run a marathon before? Okay. All right, so very strong. A half, excellent. Okay, great. Half is good. Younger days did half, excellent. So some of you guys did half ones, perfect, spectacular. My wife happens to be one of those really, really odd people who like to run for incredibly long periods of time. Yeah. And again, so most of you don't applaud her. She's insane. But the point is, for those of you, again, some of you did some halves. And when you did that half marathon, was that half marathon the first time you ran 13 miles? No, typically with a half marathon, you run that distance first, you train at that distance. If you're doing a 5K, if you're doing a 10K, right? If you're doing a half marathon, typically you train at that distance before you actually run the actual race. But what about marathon runners? When you're training for a marathon, do you run 3 marathons before you actually run that marathon, a week or 2 weeks or a month before? No, typically, when training for a marathon, they just run that 26.2 miles on the day of the race. Before that, they typically never go before 20 miles. They never run more than 20 miles while training, because something magical happens at 20 miles. Anybody know what happens? Yeah, they train up to about 18 or so. You typically don't go to 20, because what happens when you've been running for 20 miles? Yeah, just exactly. Okay, true. I would die from doing it, absolutely. But there's this magical thing that happens when you talk to these distance runners. Right about the 20-mile mark, they hit the wall, right? Well, it leads to the runner's high, absolutely. They hit a wall. That wall is that point where they cannot take another step. If they take another step, they are going to die. With 100% certainty, they know if they take one more step, they are going to die. And yet, these crazy people take that one more step, and then a second after that, and a third after that. And do they actually die from taking those extra steps? No. While every inch and ounce of their body is screaming at them to stop, they don't. And they push through it. And that pushing through it, that breaking through the wall, can sometimes lead to that runner's high that was mentioned before, right? The reason for this is something that is called, right, our systemic fatigue. Right? Let's take it back to a couple examples. Again, none of us are stupid enough to run long distances. So let's take it to something else. Like, for instance, when I was holding that book up, and I had to hold that book up until my teacher got tired, the principal got tired, right? Was I able to hold it up till he got tired? No, eventually I fatigued and I had to drop it, right? And I got swatted and I had to go back to the classroom. However, if I dropped that book, instead of getting swatted, he was going to shoot me in the head, do you think I would have been able to hold it up for a little bit longer? Or let's take it to you. We were talking about sprinting before. If I told you that you have to go outside and record yourself sprinting for 200 yards, or sprint for as long as you possibly can, and I will give you 3 points of extra credit for sprinting for as long as you possibly can, right? Many of you probably wouldn't get to the end of your block. That's as far as I can go. I'm exhausted at this point. I can't do another step. I'll die, right? And you'll try to get your extra credit that way. But what if instead a bear with an axe was chasing you? Would you be able to probably sprint a little bit further in those cases? Yeah. The reason for that is this systemic fatigue. systemic fatigue is basically a protective mechanism of your brain. And it is due to lactic acid. Remember, as we talked about, lactic acid is a toxin. So as it's being generated in your muscle cell, does the muscle cell want to keep that lactic acid inside of it? No. So what happens is our muscle cells, as they produce lactic acid, that lactic acid is released into the blood. And when it's released into the blood, there are chemoreceptors in our brain that notice that there's lactic acid in our blood. And what our brain says to us is, wow, I have lactic acid being built up. That means my muscles are working really hard. And if my muscles are working really hard, they could get injured. And I don't want my muscles to get injured. So I'm going to tell my muscles that they're tired and they can't work anymore. And so your brain tells your muscles, you can't work anymore. You got to stop. You're going to die. And it tricks the muscles into stopping. And so you stop. You're fatigued. Not because the muscle actually can't perform, but because your brain is telling you that the muscle can't perform. That's one of those big things with those endurance runners. They have to learn to ignore that. Yeah, it's very much a self-preservation. They have to ignore that and keep going. Even though every inch of their body is telling them they can't go on, they know physically they still can, and they're able to push through that wall. They're able to push through that systemic fatigue. Right? And so notice systemic fatigue is very much affected by motivation. Right? Like I said, self-preservation. If you can sprint for as long as you can for 2 points of extra credit, or you need to sprint for as long as you can because you're going to get eaten by a bear, you're going to be able to run a lot longer being chased by that bear. Not because bears suddenly make your muscles more efficient. It's just because that motivation, that stronger motivation overrides that systemic fatigue. Right? When you're being chased by the bear with an axe, your brain's like, okay, we can push these muscles a little bit harder. So all of these factors play a huge role in the fatigue of our muscles, that loss of our ability. Again, some of them are molecular, some of them are chemical, some of them are mental, top-down nervous system stuff. But all of these affect how long we are able to sustain an activity for. All right. Sorry. At least I'm not making you run for extra credit. All you had to do is come to talk to me for 5 minutes to get extra credit. And you did that. So there may be other opportunities as they come along. True. Yes. Again, when there's a bear with an axe, we have that fight or flight response. You either have to fight the bear with an axe or you have to outrun someone in the class. Absolutely. Oh, for extra credit, I didn't catch the extra credit part. No fighting bears for extra credit. All right. Clear this. So again, a depletion of metabolic resources, ionic imbalances, drop in pH, increase in temperature, damage to the muscle cells, that systemic fatigue. All of these are factors that instead of using the time to run for 13 and a half miles, just study during that time and you'll be more efficient. All right. All of these are things that lead to a muscle to not be able to perform at the level that we want it to. Now, once a muscle is fatigued, is it fatigued forever and it never goes back to being efficient again? No, of course not. Obviously, yes, our muscles can fatigue, but after they fatigue, they can recover. Recovery is that reestablishment of the normal conditions. Now, there are two main processes that are involved in this muscle fatigue. The first, and obviously one of the most important ones, is that removal of lactic acid. As we said, lactic acid is a toxin. that is damaging to that. Well, yeah, and we'll talk about why foam rolling helps. Absolutely, that's a great point. Stretching, you don't even have to foam roll. Just stretching after exercise makes a huge difference in this recovery. Because one of the things we need to do is remove that lactic acid. It is a toxin. And how do we get rid of it, as we mentioned? Well, there's basically two ways. The first is the easy way. Release it into the blood. Let somebody else deal with it. If the muscles release it into the blood, it's going to go to the liver and the kidneys. Our kidneys release it into the urine, and our liver breaks it down. So the kidneys release from the body, and the liver converts it back to pyruvic acid into those pyruvates. So we need to get rid of the lactic acid. And guess what? So we can release it and do it that way, or the muscle cell itself can convert the the lactic acid into pyruvic acid. But whether it occurs in the kidneys or whether it occurs, in the liver, or whether it occurs in the muscle cell, to convert the lactic acid requires oxygen. And that really leads to the second key process for recovery. What the fancy word for it is, we have to repay our oxygen debt. So much of the functions of that muscle contraction rely on oxygen. As I mentioned, we need oxygen to convert the lactic acid into pyruvate. But then with oxygen, that pyruvate can enter the mitochondria and be converted into ATP. And we need lots of ATP to recover. Right? We need it to make ATP for pumps to reestablish our ion concentrations, like that sodium, potassium, ATP ACE, that pump. Remind me again, that sodium, potassium, ATP ACE uses 1 ATP to kick how many sodiums out of the cell? Sodium, potassium, ATP ACE kicks how many?
Three sodium, 2 potassium.
There you go. Kicks 3 sodiums out, brings 2 potassiums back in. Excellent. So we need it for reestablishing the ion concentrations, right? So we need the pumps to be able to do that. Remember also, we have stored glycogen. Must be replaced. So we need to be able to get glucose into the cell. And then convert it into glycogen for storage. And guess what we need to convert glucose into glycogen?
The glycolysis.
Well, it requires ATP, and ATP requires oxygen, right? Remember, in our muscle cell, not only do we store large amounts of glucose in the form of glycogen, but don't we also have a special molecule that stores oxygen?
Yes.
What was that
Hemoglobin.
called again? What was it?
Hemoglobin.
Was hemoglobin? What was it?
Hemoglobin, I said.
Myoglobin. Remember, it's hemoglobin in the red blood cells, but myoglobin here. So we need lots of ATP. So we need lots of oxygen, right? All about paying back this oxygen debt. We need to replace, repair, and make new proteins. All of that requires ATP and oxygen. So we have this massive oxygen debt that needs to be repaid from vigorously using this muscle. And you haven't thought of it in those terms, but you're absolutely aware of it. Because while you're sitting here calmly in your chair, you're breathing at what? 12 breaths per minute. If you were to get up and run around your room 17 times, would your respiration rate go up as a result of that? Do we have to demonstrate? Yeah, no, absolutely. Your breathing rate would go up because you had more need of oxygen because you're using those muscles actively, and so your breathing rate goes up. The second you sit down and stop using those muscles, does your breathing rate instantly go back to rest? No, your breathing rate stays elevated for a prolonged period of time. Why are you breathing faster for a longer period of time, even though you're not exercising the muscle? Because you have to repay that oxygen debt. We need to get that oxygen to our muscle cells so that they can recover. So that we see that in our muscles. And if you think about it, our muscles are not the only organs or organ systems that incur an oxygen debt. Let's emphasize this. What other organs or organ systems might incur an oxygen debt when you exercise? Give me some
Brain.
examples.
Brain.
Go ahead.
The brain.
Yeah, our nervous tissue. If you think about it, that neuron, that somatic motor neuron, is releasing a massive amount of acetylcholine. So it needs to endocytose acetylcholine. It has to make more acetylcholine, right? So that it can do all that again. Our cardiovascular system, our heart, our cardiac muscle is doing more work. Absolutely. What else? I can think of at least one more good one.
Respiratory.
Respiratory muscles, absolutely. So even if you're running, we don't think about the respiratory muscles, but absolutely the respiratory muscles are going to need more oxygen to be able to repay their debt from all of that excess breathing. There you go. That was the one I was thinking of, the integumentary system. If you get up and run around the room 17 times, you're going to sweat. Right. And that production of that secretion, do we need to replace those cells that have been that resources from those cells that have been metabolically active? Absolutely. So as you can see, there are many other organs and organ systems that incur that oxygen debt just from the use of our muscles. And so we get rid of the lactic acid, we get rid of, we repay our oxygen debt. And once that is accomplished, then we're able to recover. And here's the other key, is the recovery rate. So let's go ahead and stick with this. Is the recovery rate the same for all activities?
No.
No. So let's say, for instance, what kind of activities do you think are most exhausting? Let's take two examples. Again, we just missed out on the opportunity to have the Summer Olympics, so that's great. Let's take those runners. Two different types of runners, Usain Bolt and Meb, right? Usain Bolt is a sprinter. Meb is a marathon runner. Which of those two activities require more recovery? The sprinting,
Marathon.
Marathon runner.
the marathon runner. Notice that sprint typically lasts for a short period of time. So while it is an incredibly intense activity, that intense activity only lasts for a short period of time. Running a marathon, you are running at a much lower, slower rate, but it is a much more prolonged activity. So as it turns out, that slower and longer requires the most recovery. And again, you may not have thought of it in those terms, but again, let's go back to the Olympics. In the Olympics, a sprinter like Usain Bolt or a sprint swimmer like Michael Phelps, how many races may they have during the course of a day? 2, 3, right? Again, there was Olympics a couple of years ago where Michael Phelps had 4 different races in the same day, all within 3 hours of each other. And so there was all this talk about, was he going to be able to get the rest in between? Very powerful, very intense activities where they fatigue, but they also have a much more rapid recovery. How many marathons does that marathon runner run during the course of a day? 1. In fact, he just runs 1 during the entire Olympics. So that slower, longer activity is much actually more impactful on the muscles and actually requires more recovery. All right. So again, getting rid of that lactic acid, paying that oxygen debt. Oh, making more. Oh, I even forgot about that. There you go. Part of that oxygen debt, we also need to replace the creatine phosphate. Right, our creatine phosphate has given up all of its phosphates. So not only do we need to make more ATP, we need to make more creatine phosphate. So we have to repay that oxygen debt. And like we said, it affects other organ systems as well. All right, questions on that? All right, that is everything that we need from a lecture standpoint. It's a little early to take our next break. So let's go ahead and switch gears and talk about our lab stuff. So I missed the Olympics too. There we go. That one. Alrighty, so, oops, hold on. All right, so hopefully you have your red and blue pens handy. If not, take a minute and grab those, because what we need to do is we need to come back here and we need to talk about the muscles, origins, insertions, and actions that we were talking about. We had made it through almost all. I had hoped to get through all of the muscles of the arm that we needed to know the origins and the insertions of. The good news is there was only one that was left that we didn't get to. The bad news is it's the Triceps Brachia. Why is that bad news? Right, because it is a triceps, it has 3 heads, meaning that not only do we need to identify their 3 heads, but what else do we need to do for those 3 heads?
3 different origins.
3 different origins, absolutely. So let's do that, starting first here on our pretty picture. Let's make this a little bit bigger. That works. Excellent. So our Triceps Brachia has 3 heads. And actually, let's look at the picture from the textbook first. While, as we mentioned, on the anterior surface of the arm, there were 3 main muscles that were flexors of the elbow. Here on the posterior part of the arm, there is really only one major muscle that is a posterior, in the posterior compartment of the arm. And that one muscle is the Triceps Brachia. The triceps brachia, being a posterior muscle, is going to be involved in what type of actions?
Extension.
Extension, right? Anterior is flex and posterior is extend. What was the one exception to that again? Remember, we talked about all flexions are anterior, all extensions are posterior, except for the knee. The knee is the one exception, but we haven't gotten to the leg yet, so we don't have to worry about that. Excellent. The nice thing about the tricep brachia is, again, like all muscle groups, they come together into a single tendon, and that single tendon is going to have a single insertion. So all you need to do is find this prominent tendon on the posterior part of the arm. And once you find this prominent tendon, we can easily identify the three muscles, the three individual heads. The first head is here on the outside of the arm, furthest from the midline. And what would we call this muscle that is furthest from the midline?
Lateral.
Lateral head. And notice the lateral head is over here by itself. Our lateral head is lonely. Anytime we have a lateral something, what are we also likely to have?
Medial.
Medial.
A medial something. And lo and behold, on the inside of the arm, we have a small, tiny little belly that is on the inside of the arm. And so that, of course, is the, I can sneak it in here, medial belly. And the medial, as I mentioned, is the smallest belly. So the medial is mini. That leaves us with one remaining belly. And that one remaining belly, if you notice, it goes all the way up to and connects to the scapula, meaning it has a longer tendon that has to follow a longer distance to get to its destination. And so any muscle that has a long tendon to go all the way up to the scapula, what belly must that be?
Long head.
All right, so the long is long. There you go. So the lateral is lonely, the medial is mini, blah, blah, blah. The lateral is lonely, the medial is mini, and the long is long. So those are the three bellies of the tricep brachia. All right. Questions on the muscles? All right, then let's look at their origins and insertions so we can figure out the actions. Now, we'll do it in the reverse order because it's easier that way. We only need one insertion, and all of them have a common tendon that inserts into what bone feature?
The olecranon process of the ulna.
Yeah, right. That single bump of your elbow. Of course, I got a long sleeve. So that single bump of your elbow, that olecranon process of the ulna. So right here is the insertion. Excellent. So now we just need to figure out the origins. Starting first with the lateral head. Now, as we mentioned, this is a posterior muscle. So when we're talking about the origins, all of them are going to be posterior origins. So that's going to be simple. So all of them are going to have a posterior origin. And the lateral head, guess which side of the humerus the lateral head is going to be located? lateral. So our posterior origin, a lateral origin. And again, because it's lonely, it's over here by itself, it also is proximal. So if we look at the origin of the lateral head, it's basically the posterior, lateral, and proximal surface of the humerus. All right. Questions on that? All right. So when we talk about, oh, and actually I should have, sorry. This, of course, is the lateral origin. Oops. Perfect. So let's talk about the medial origin. Now, again, this is the Triceps Brachia, so it must have a posterior origin. It is the medial head, so of course it is going to have a medial origin. But remember, the medial muscle is mini. It is short. It is small. So is it going to be able to get all the way up to the top of the humerus? No. So it is going to be a distal origin. So when we look at the origin of the medial head, the origin of the medial head is the distal, medial, and posterior surface of the humerus. All right. Of course, that brings us to our long origin. Our long origin is indeed long. In fact, as we said, it is so long that it doesn't connect to the humerus. Instead, what is the origin of the long head? Infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. So remember, there is this roughened bump down here, right underneath the glenoid cavity. I'm exaggerating this a little bit to make sure we see it because I use the dark red here. This roughened bump underneath the glenoid cavity is indeed the origin of the long head. So those are our three origins that all come together into one insertion. And as you can see, the names help you to remember where they originate. The lateral is lonely, the medial is mini, the long is long. Now, we have to fix questions on the attachment points. All right, excellent. If we're comfortable with the attachment points, then let's talk actions. How many joints does this cross? 2. Thanks to the long head, this crosses the shoulder and this crosses the elbow. Being a posterior muscle, what is the effect on the shoulder going to be?
Extend.
Extend, excellent. Thanks to the posterior muscle on the elbow, what's it going to do?
Extend.
Extend. So this extends the shoulder and extends the elbow. Now notice also, is it on the stable bone or the movable bone of the forearm? It's on the stable bone. So can our tricep brachia pronate or supinate the same way our bicep brachia can? No, right? Because it does not. So again, remember, with an extension of the elbow, extension of the shoulder, you're bringing it back. So as I bring it back to here, or even hyperextend, I'm extending that. So if you think about this, if you think about it, when you go bowling on Friday night, when you start your bowl, you extend your elbow and you extend your arm. That brings it back. And then when you're going to throw the ball, you need to flex the shoulder, flex the elbow, and keep your arm supinated. You need to supinate your hand to put that nice spin on the ball as you're doing that. And that's why your whole arm hurts the next day after you've gone bowling the night before, because you're using your tricep brachia and your bicep brachia. Tricep brachia brings the ball back. Bicep brachia throws the ball. So that's why your arm hurts after bowling, because you're using your tricep brachia and your bicep brachia. All right. Questions on that? Excellent. So there you go. Just that simply then, we have now completed all of the muscles of the arm we need to know origins and insertions for. However, that doesn't mean we're done with the arm. We have a lot of other muscles to talk about, starting first with a proximal muscle group. This proximal muscle group is associated with the shoulder. And in fact, conveniently enough, we have this great model in the classroom that peels away all the rest of the muscles and just shows us this muscle group that affects the shoulder, affects the movement of the humerus. Notice it relates to our friend, the scapula. While we don't need to know the origins and the insertions of this muscle, we do, I'm sure you recall, remember that there was an indentation in the space above the spine on the posterior part of the scapula. What was that indentation in the scapula above the spine called? Indentation, so it was a fossa above the spine, so it was the supraspinous fossa. Absolutely, supraspinous fossa. Notice there is a nice big muscle sitting in that supraspinous fossa. Guess what muscle that is sitting inside of the supraspinous fossa?
Supraspinous muscle.
Well, it's not the supraspinous muscle. It's close though. It's the supraspinatus. Excellent. Notice there is a muscle in the indentation below the spine. What was this indentation below the spine called?
Spinate fossa.
There you go, infraspinous fossa. And the muscle sitting in the infraspinous fossa, guess what that is?
Spinatus muscle.
Right. Infra
Infraspinatus.
Excellent. Remember, on the anterior side of the scapula, there is this big, huge fossa on the anterior side of the scapula. What was that one called again? It was on the anterior side, but remember, it was also on the underside of the scapula. So it was the,
Scapular fossa.
what was it?
Subscapular.
There you go, the subscapular fossa. And guess what muscle sits in the subscapular fossa?
Subscapularis.
Excellent. The subscapularis sits in the subscapular fossa. Perfect. All right. So notice we had these three indentations and we have these three muscles. Now, notice one more thing, and I'm going to use orange for this one. Oops, nope, not for that. I want that to be black. I want this to be orange. Notice, and it's a little tricky to see here, there is a muscle here that kind of hangs out by itself. We see it here. We see it here. There's this muscle that hangs out here by itself. It's actually a separate bellied muscle that hangs out here underneath the scapula and holds on there. Does anybody happen to know what this muscle might be called? It's a large, round muscle, round-bellied muscle. Round is sometimes referred to as teres.
Teres Minor.
Well, actually, it's the teres major. It's a big round muscle. It is indeed the teres major. However, is the teres major on your list?
No.
So you don't care. But why it's useful is it is a very good landmark. And once you find that landmark of the teres major makes it easier for you to find this smaller round muscle that sits right here underneath the infraspinatus. And guess what this tiny little round muscle sitting under the infraspinatus is?
Minor.
Teres minor. And that is a muscle you are responsible for. So here we have 5 muscles, only 4 you're responsible for. The supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, the subscapularis, and the teres minor.
So what specific activity belongs to only this small muscle like teres minor?
Well, if only we had a list of the actions we were responsible for, we could absolutely figure them out. But let's talk about what they do together, because remember, as I mentioned, they are a muscle group. Again, you don't need to know their origins, but if I showed you a scapula and I pointed to the supraspinous fossa, should you know what muscle sits in that space? Absolutely, right? But what I want you to do is look at this. Notice for all of these muscles, and let's pick a different color now. Yellow is a good one. Notice all the tendons of all of these muscles come and wrap around the head of the humerus. In fact, these 4 muscles are the only muscles that attach to the head of the humerus. And if you think about it, they stabilize the head of the humerus, locking the head of the humerus in place in that very loose joint, almost forming like a collar or a cuff-like structure over the top of that ball and socket joint. What might the name of this muscle group be?
Rotator cuff?
Exactly. These 4 muscles collectively form our rotator cuff. You hear about pitchers, you hear about quarterbacks, people who put a lot of torque into their shoulder having rotator cuff injuries. Those rotator cuff injuries are usually a stretch or a tear to these tendons of one or more of these 4 muscles that are holding it in place. Yes, absolutely. Rotator cuff injuries are absolutely not fun. All right, so here is a muscle group collectively known as the rotator cuff. because they help to hold and stabilize the head of the humerus in place. And it's those four muscles, the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, the subscapularis, and the teres minor. Now, let's talk actions. Notice the supraspinatus comes right over the top. Because of its orientation, it comes right over the top and right onto the humerus. So when this muscle contracts as it comes over the top, right? Exactly, it is going to elevate the arm laterally. And what's the fancy word we have for that? Abduct, absolutely. It abducts the arm. Now, don't we have another lateral muscle that abducts the arm? What was the other big lateral muscle that abducted the arm?
Deltoid?
Deltoid, absolutely. And the deltoid is indeed the primary abductor of this. Notice the supraspinatus is much lower, so it is only able to abduct the arm about 20 degrees. That's about all it's able to do, right? So it's useful for doing that chicken dance when you're at a wedding. But if you want to bring the arm all the way up, you need to use the deltoid for that. So as someone mentioned, these are stabilizing and holding that humerus in place, but because the supraspinatus comes right over the top, it can assist in our abduction. So it only has one action. Look at the subscapularis. The subscapularis, remember, is in the front. It comes straight across to the shoulder. So when it comes straight across that straight angle, all it's able to do is pull on the front of the humerus. And if you pulled on the front of the humerus, what would the action there be? Again, don't elevate, it doesn't bring it up or down. All it's doing is taking the head of the humerus and bringing it forward. What action is that? Again, you have the list in front of you. How many actions does the subscapularis have?
Medially rotate.
Exactly. It medially rotates the humerus. So medially rotates the humerus, brings the humerus in. Right, so both of those muscles only have one action because they're pretty much straight on, straight from the top, straight from the front. But notice, because of the spine, the infraspinatus is at an angle. So it's kind of angled at the way that it attaches. Now, the subscapularis is in the front, so it medially rotates. The infraspinatus at the back, so it laterally rotates the humerus. But because it's also at an angle, what else is it able to do?
Adduct.
Adduct. So notice the infraspinatus is going to adduct and laterally rotate, right? This is the one, right, you use in film, right, or you use in theater, right, when you do that jazz hands. Bring the arm in, laterally rotate, jazz hands, right? So you do that both sides, you get that jazz hands. That is that infraspinatus that allows you to do that. Notice the teres minor is basically right next to the infraspinatus, but a little bit lower. So the infraspinatus laterally rotates the humerus, so can the teres minor. The infraspinatus adducts the humerus, so does the teres minor. But because the teres minor is a little bit inferior, it has an even better angle at the humerus, so it can do one more thing. And what's that one more thing that it can assist in doing?
Adduct.
Well, it adducts, it laterally rotates, and it also extends, right? It brings it back, right? So it adducts, laterally rotates, and extends. All right, so it brings it back, brings it in. I always think of this in terms of that tennis stroke. If you're going to do that forehand in tennis, you got to make sure you keep your elbow in, right? You got to bring the racket out, and you got to bring it back so that you can do that forehand shot with that tennis racket. That is what this one does. Now, and again, this kind of gets back to the point that was made earlier. I think Joed made it. Obviously, the teres minor, is it going to be the major muscle, the primary muscle that extends the shoulder? No, of course not. Obviously, something that small isn't going to be the power to have to be the primary one. These are all helping to stabilize and assisting in these actions, right? They assist in these actions, but they're not going to obviously be the primary movers of the arm, but they are very helpful in assisting in that. There you go. Getting ready to do that sprinkler dance move, right? Excellent. Absolutely. All right. See, there you go. Like Laura pointed out, it's all about wooing women. All right. Questions on that? So those are the 4 muscles. Notice this model does a great job of showing them independently, but we can see them in location as well. Notice here in its place on the anterior side of the scapula, we see the subscapularis. We see that supraspinatus coming over from the top. Here from the back, again, we see the supraspinatus coming over the top. We see the infraspinatus. And again, remember the infraspinatus is one of those multipennate muscles. So frequently when you look at this, you will see multiple fascicles that are coming together into this. So that all of oops, hold on, too much. All of this is the infraspinatus, but don't forget, underneath that infraspinatus is going to be the teres minor. So there's the teres minor. And notice the other thing that you can see nicely, and I'm going to go ahead and clear that so you can see it. Notice here you get a better sense of that teres major. Notice the teres major, there's a gap in between. So that teres major really is a round, separate muscle. It's not one of the things that you're responsible for, but it makes it a very easy landmark to find. And then once you find that, then right across from the teres major is where you're going to find your teres minor. All right. So there you go. 4 quick muscles, a muscle group, yet another muscle group, the rotator cuff. So you need to know them collectively as the rotator cuff, but obviously you need to know the individual muscles and their actions as well. All right. Questions on that? All right. That brings us to the forearm. As I mentioned earlier, I think the forearm is probably the most challenging part of the arm because there are a ton of muscles in that area, dozens of muscles in that area. The good news is for you, you're only really responsible for 7. 3 forearm muscles on the anterior side, 3 forearm muscles on the posterior side. They're all superficial. And that one special landmark muscle that we talked about that lines up on the forearm. And what was that one again? That anchor one, the one that we learned that actually isn't technically a forearm muscle. It doesn't affect the hand or the wrist, but it affects the elbow. What was that muscle again?
Brachioradialis.
Brachial radialis. So that brachial radialis. And remember, we mentioned we could use it as a landmark. Let's do this. Perfect. This is what I want. So if you go to that, oh, here, let's actually start at the beginning. Again, the Virtual Anatomy Lab from Cosumnes River College. It's one of the things in the study guide. If you come to the muscular system and you come to the limbs, we have some great pictures here. Notice here, we see a great view and they actually have the pictures labeled and unlabeled. Notice here, we can actually, under the deltoid, see the infraspinatus, the teres minor, teres major, which again, you're not responsible for, deltoid. Notice as we saw very, very clearly here. Remember that deltoid is that arrow-shaped muscle that points straight to the brachialis. Those 3 nice bellies on the lateral aspect, the long head of the bicep brachia. And here's that lonely lateral head of the tricep brachia. Notice there's the long head of the tricep brachia going all the way up to the scapula. And we see just the teeniest bit of the medial head of the tricep brachia, but all off of this one tendon going to the bump of the elbow. Here we see the two bellies of the bicep brachia coming up here, the brachialis deep to that there. And again, those other muscles we can see. Medial head of the tricep brachia really nicely from this side. Subscapularis, again, really nicely there. But this is where I actually wanted to begin. All right, notice right here, this muscle right here, if we flip the arm over, is this muscle right here. This muscle right here, remember, is our brachial radialis. This is the one with that bodybuilder pose that we talked about. And it's easy to identify because it lines right up with the thumb. So if you line this right up with the thumb, this is an excellent starting point for finding our way around the forearm. For this, I really don't want you to take any notes. We'll go through all of this again with the pretty pictures from your textbook, but I really want you to watch and listen and think, because I think this is the key. I think people overcomplicate the forearm. The key to the forearm is two things. The first thing is to find a good starting point. And that good starting point is right here, the brachial radialis. Lines up with the thumb, easy to find and identify. The second thing you need to do is to follow the tendons. All right. And as long as you can do that, you are going to be able to identify these. The link is in your study area. So if we go to, great question. Let's do this again. Hold on a second. Let me get to the right place. In your modules, under the study tools, it's the very first link. Cosumnes River College's Virtual Anatomy Lab. There's some other great ones. This Virtual Anatomy Lab is really excellent. Right, this is also where you can get to our YouTube thing, some other tools, some great resources that are in here that you are able to do. Access to the free Fall Tutoring Center is there. All of these things here, but you click here and you get to the Virtual Anatomy Lab. And from there, you can get to pictures like this. So the key to this is to find a good starting point. And that good starting point, as I mentioned, is this muscle right here, the brachial radialis. Once you find that brachial radialis, you can work your way all the way around the arm. Now, first, we're going to just focusing on identifying the muscles. Find a starting point, and once you find that starting point, follow the tendons. The tendons will tell you everything you need to know. So let's start by working our way onto the posterior side of the arm. So again, this muscle right here, that muscle right there, lines up with the thumb. That is the brachial radialis. Okay? With me so far? All right, so what are we going to do from that? We're on the posterior side of the arm. Posterior side of the arm are going to be muscles that are primarily going to have what type of action associated with them? If you're on the post side, you extend. So notice, and I will highlight it right here, this muscle right next to the brachial radialis has a very small belly and a very long tendon that goes to the thumb side of the hand. What bone is on the thumb side of the hand? Radius. So this is a posterior muscle that is going to affect the wrist bones, move the wrist, attaches to the thumb side of the hand, and has a very long tendon. Guess what muscle that is, based on the list that's in front of you.
Extensor Radialis.
And you'd get partial credit for that on the exam because what'd you miss?
Extensor carpi radialis muscle.
Nope, not the muscle.
Longus.
There you go, longus. Extensor carpi radialis longus. It is a big mouthful name, but it tells you everything about it. Extensor, posterior muscle. Radialis, connects to the thumb side. Carpal, right, crosses the carp. So extensor carpi crosses the wrist on the thumb side, radialis, and it has a long tendon, a small belly and a very long tendon. Notice the tendon starts right here. It has a very small belly and a very long tendon. So that is the extensor carpi radialis longus. Now, as we know, anytime you have a longus of something, what are you likely to have?
Short.
A shortest or a brevis. And indeed, there is an extensor carpi radialis brevis, but is it on your list?
No.
No, so we don't care. But it's a nice landmark, so let's put a dark spot on it just to remind us that it's a landmark, but we don't care about it. So then we get to our next muscle. Notice this muscle has a nice big belly on the posterior side of the arm. But once again, we are going to pay attention to the tendons. And notice in this case, it doesn't form one tendon, it forms 3 tendons going way out to the fingers. So what do you think we call this posterior muscle of the arm whose tendons go out to 3 of our 5 fingers?
Extensor carpi ulnaris.
No.
Extensor digitorum.
Extensor digitorum. Because guess what an extensor digitorum does?
Goes to your digits.
It extends the digits, absolutely, right? It's in the name. Notice it doesn't go to the thumb, but we know the thumb is a very special organ. It also doesn't go to the pinky. And not surprisingly, we do have a tiny muscle that goes to the pinky, extensor digitorum minimus, the mini-me, right? $1 million. But again, is that minimus on our list? No. So again, we don't care. But it's a landmark that helps us to find the third muscle we are responsible for. The third muscle we are responsible for has a posterior belly, but notice where it goes is its tendon comes here on the back side of the hand on the pinky side. So guess what we call this muscle whose tendon goes behind the wrist on the pinky side?
Extensor carpi ulnaris.
Extensor carpi ulnaris. And there you go. Just that easily, by following the tendons, we can find the 3 posterior muscles we are responsible for. The extensor carpi radialis longus, the extensor digitorum, the extensor carpi ulnaris. Questions on that?
Easy.
It is. It really is that easy. If you really take the time with it, it really is just that easy. And guess what? The front of the hand is just that easy as well, as long as you follow the tendons. Because I want you to notice one other thing while we're on the back side of the arm here. Notice there is a belly right here, right next to the right next to the extensor carpi ulnaris. We see the belly of it, but do you see its tendon? You don't see its tendon from this view. And the reason for that is because the tendon comes to the front. Notice again, here when we look at the anterior side, we barely see the belly, but this time we see the tendon, and the tendon actually comes in front of the wrist on the pinky side. You can actually hear, let me take off my watch because this is easier, right? Feel that bump on the pinky side. What is that bump that you feel on the pinky side?
The radial
Pinky side.
ulnar notch.
Nope, close. It is the ulna, but what bone feature do you feel there in your wrist? What is that bump?
Styloid process of the ulna.
Styloid process of the ulna. Excellent. Here on the back side of your arm, you have two muscle bellies side by side. One of their tendons goes behind the styloid process, so it is the extensor carpi ulnaris. The other's belly starts back here on the posterior side, but its tendon comes in front of the styloid process. And so when it contracts, it brings the arm down. So what would we call this muscle? If the one back here is the extensor carpi ulnaris, what would the one right next to it be?
Brachialis longus.
Nope. If it's the
Flexor radialis.
nope. Laura, were you saying it?
Flexor carpi.
Flexor carpi.
There you go. Extensor carpi ulnaris extends the hand on the pinky side. Flexor carpi ulnaris flexes the hand on the ulnar side. So again, it's tricky when you look at them because they both start on the back, but it's all about where the tendon goes. The one whose tendon goes to the back is the extensor. The one whose tendon comes to the front is the flexor. Again, you can see this. There's a nice prominent tendon there. In fact, there are 3 prominent tendons you can actually see on your forearm. In most cases, if you take your hand and you flex your hand, you can see those 3 tendons that stick out. Right? You can see those 3 nice prominent tendons. It's best to do this on your right hand. It tends to be more prominent on your right hand, but you can make those 3 tendons stick out. These 3 tendons are the 3 muscles we care about. This one here is on the pinky side. So as we mentioned, the one on the pinky side on the front is the flexor carpi ulnaris. Well, guess what? This one over here, whose tendon goes to the thumb side, guess what it is?
Radialis, flexor carpi radialis.
Flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor carpi radialis. The ulnaris goes to the pinky, the flexor carpi radialis goes to the thumb. And notice what's in between them. In between them, we have a small bellied muscle with a very long tendon that goes straight to the palm of the hand. Guess what that muscle in between the flexor carpi radialis and the flexor carpi ulnaris is?
Palmaris longus.
Palmaris longus. Now, as you're looking at your forearms, there's one thing that should, especially if you use your right. If you use your right hand, this here, I'm going to clear these for a second so you can see this. Notice the tendon of our palmaris longus is very superficial. So pretty much most everybody on your right hand should be able to get that palmaris longus to stick out. You might not be able to get it to stick out on your left palm because on your left hand, for some people, as many as 25% of the population, although it may be less than that, that muscle is missing. It's fused with other muscles developmentally, and you don't see it. But the reason that the palmaris longus's tendon sticks out so prominently is if you notice, there happens to be a connective tissue sheath that sits and stabilizes most of our tendons in place. As it turns out, it doesn't stabilize the palmaris longus. Palmaris longus goes right over the top of it, but it does stabilize the other ones in place. Anyone have an idea what this structure on the anterior side of the hand that stabilizes the tendons and holds it in place might be? Flexor retiniculum. Excellent. And while we're talking about it, notice when we look at the back of the hand, is there a nice, big, thick band of connective tissue that stabilizes the tendons on the posterior side? Yep. Guess what that's called?
Extensor retiniculum.
Extensor retiniculum. Another place you see this really nicely, and let's cheat and go back to it real quick. There we go. Oops. This picture, I'm not sure here. Oh yeah, we can see it. So notice here, we don't see the extensor retiniculum, but if you look closely down here at the bottom, you can see the flexor retiniculum, and you can also see the palmaris longus, how it goes over the top of it, how it's not held in place. That's the one tendon that's not held in place by the flexor retiniculum. So it's typically, at least you can usually make at least one prominent tendon stick out, and that's usually the palmaris longus. All right. So notice one last thing. Once we work our way back around the arm, our flexor carpi ulnaris, our palmaris longus, our flexor carpi radialis, notice we are right back where we began at our brachial radialis. Use that brachial radialis as a starting point. Once you have that anchor point, then you can follow the muscles around, follow the tendons, and they will tell you everything about them. You can find the muscles and you can tell what they do. And their names tell you what they do as well. Flexors, what do flexors do?
Flexion.
Flex the wrist. What do extensors do?
Extend the wrist.
Extend the wrist. What do ulnarises do? If they're on the pinky side and they contract, what do they do?
Extend the ulna.
Nope.
Flex.
Is that a flex?
No, just
Notice if I'm in anatomical position, that would take my hand and pull it towards the midline. So muscles on the pinky side, the ulnarises, when they contract, they bring the hand towards the midline, and that is an adduction of the hand. And the radialises, when they contract, bring my hand away from the midline. So that would be an abduction. So notice their location, their names tell you everything about them. Flexors flex, extensors extend. Ulnaris is adduct, radialis is abduct. And so if you look at the list, they tell you exactly what they do. We can see this really nicely on the forearm of the body, but let's look at the pretty pictures from your textbook and let's do it one more time. Let us beat this dead horse so that, again, you guys can be comfortable with it. Notice, first key, find a starting point. That starting point is that brachial radialis, that muscle that lines up with the thumb, brings our body to, our hand, our forearm to body neutral position. Right next to it is a small muscle with a long tendon that goes to the back of the hand. What is this small muscle with the long tendon that goes to the back of the hand?
Extensor carpi radialis longus.
Bingo. Extensor carpi radialis longus. Notice if you have a longus, you have a brevis. It's a landmark, but not one we need to know. And so from there, we go to a muscle here, who, if we follow its tendon, branches to go to 3 of the 5 digits. So what is this next muscle we need to know with the tendon that branches to go to the digits? Oh, and actually, let's put it all together. Hold on, before we do that. Extensor carpi radialis longus. How many actions? 2. What do they do? Extend the wrist because it's an extensor and it's on the thumb side, so it
abduct.
abducts the hand. Excellent. Extensor Digitorum, 3 tendons that go to the digits. And again, it's neither a radialis or an ulnaris, so it's not going to abduct or adduct. So what does our extensor digitorum do?
Extend phalanges.
Yeah, extends the phalanges, right? Right, so that when you're in the bar, you can tell them you want 3 Long Island iced teas, right? So you can raise those fingers up. Of course, it doesn't do the pinky. That's what the mini-me, $1 million, does. But again, not on our list. We don't care about that. So right next to it is a muscle whose belly is back here. But more importantly, its tendon goes behind the styloid process on the pinky side. And what's that muscle whose tendon goes behind the styloid process on the pinky side?
Extensor ulnaris.
Carpal ulnaris.
Carpal ulnaris.
And what are its 2 actions?
Extension of the wrist
And
also adduct.
there you go. Perfect. Excellent. All right. Notice as we work our way around that, on the back side, we see this nice big prominent muscle belly, but we don't care about the belly. What we care about is where the tendon goes. And where the tendon goes, as we can see now, notice from the anterior side, we don't really see the belly. Most of the belly is on the posterior side, but what matters is its tendon. And its tendon comes in front of the styloid process on the pinky side. So it is the flexor carpi ulnaris that, of course, flexes the hand. And what else does it do to the hand? It's on the ulnaris side.
Abduct.
There you go. Abduct. Excellent. Notice then next to it is this muscle with a very small belly and a very long tendon that goes straight to the palm of the hand. What muscle is that?
Palmaris Longus.
There you go. What is its action?
Flex the wrist.
Yep, flex the wrist. Notice this one is right in the middle, so it can't abduct or adduct. All it does is flexes. And then next to that is a muscle with a tendon that goes to the thumb side on the front, the flexor carpi radialis. And what are its 2 actions?
Flex and adduct.
There you go. And notice from there, we're right back at the brachioradialis again. Find the brachioradialis, follow the tendons. If you do that, you can find your muscles. 3 superficial muscles on the anterior side, 3 superficial muscles on the posterior side, and their tendons tell you everything. And again, notice we have that nice flexor retiniculum on the anterior side and the extensor retiniculum on the posterior side. Excellent. Questions on that? All right, with that, we are done with the arm. And that's exhausting. I think this is a good stopping point for taking our first break. We still need to go. We still need to get more of our leg done so we don't have to do all of the leg on Monday because we still have a fair amount of material to cover for the physiology as well. And on Monday, we're finally going to get back to smooth muscle and skeletal muscle. We've learned everything you ever wanted to know and more about skeletal muscle. We need to now be able to relate that to smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. So we have a lot to cover. So we still have a fair amount to do, but we also still have a fair amount of time. So let's go ahead and take our last break. I cannot get my phone to turn on to tell me what time it is. It is 10:55. So let's come back at 11:10, and 11:10 we will pick up from here. So we will restart at 11:10. And I will start the recording at that point. All right. Questions on any of that? I appreciate this forearm is a lot to go over at first, but I promise you, if you take your time, you find a starting point, you work your way around it from there. Ankle, are you standing during lecture? That's a good way to stay awake. But yeah, so go ahead, stretch that out.
Actually, I broke it, sir, when I was in college.
Oh my.
I was bowling and crickets, so I just fall down.
Oh,
And
yeah.
there was a linear fracture, hairline fracture.
Oh,
So still I'm suffering. I don't know. It
now,
hurts.
is this the kind of thing where it means it's going to rain tomorrow? Because sometimes, people have these types of injuries when the joint hurts. That means that usually that there's a drop in the barometric pressure. That means it's going to rain. Are you telling me it's going to rain?
I don't know about this.
Okay, well, we'll see. We'll see if you're a prognosticator. Excellent. All right, let's take a 15-minute break. Come back at 11:10, and 11:10, we will move on to the leg. I will see you guys in 15 minutes. All righty. Home stretch. Any questions before we get started? All righty, excellent. With this then, we can move on to the muscles that move the leg. We will start with everybody's favorite muscle, and that is, of course, the gluteus maximus. It is a prominent superficial posterior muscle of the leg. Let's take a closer look at it here. Here we can see it here. Again, it is posterior muscle, what we commonly refer to as the posterior. But notice also from its fascicles, we can see that not only is it posterior, but it is very medial and projects laterally from that as well. And we really see this when we look at its origins and its insertions. So let's switch back to that. There we go. So our gluteus maximus is a prominent posterior muscle, and not surprisingly, a very posterior origin and insertion. What is the origin of the gluteus maximus?
Dorsal ilium, sacrum, and coccyx.
Excellent. So along the coccyx, along the sacrum, and the dorsal part of the ilium, not so much out onto all the way out onto the crest, but just this dorsal part. So it's basically this nice prominent posterior and dorsal origin. And what is the bony insertion? Again, guys, you should have these lists in front of you, so it should be easy to read this off. The whole point of me doing this is for this class to be interactive. If you guys just want to study this on your own and not interested in interacting, then I'm happy to take the rest of the day off. But if you're interested in engaging with me, then I'm happy to help walk you through this material. So what is the insertion? Excellent. So the sacrum, the coccyx is absolutely the origin, but what is the insertion of the gluteus maximus?
Gluteal tuberosity and iliotibial band or tract.
Excellent. So let's talk about the bony part first. Remember, on the posterior part of the femur, we have that nice big V-shaped rough attachment point that is at the top of the linea aspera. And so that is indeed the bony insertion for that. All right. But notice if you look back at the picture, while we can see that small part that indeed does insert in that V shape onto the back of the femur, notice a lot of it attaches to this big, huge fibrous structure that is on the lateral aspect of the leg that goes all the way up from the crest of the ilium all the way down onto the tibia. And what might this big, long, fibrous structure that goes from the ilium all the way to the tibia be called? Excellent. The IT band. Of course, are you going to call it an IT band on the exam? No, the iliotibial band, right? So, but you're right. Absolutely. There's plenty of runners or soccer players or things along those lines who have IT band issues. This is against, I remember someone talking about rolling, right? That rolling is very good for helping to stretch out the iliotibial band. Rolling and stretching also helps to get the blood flow, which again gets more oxygen, gets rid of more lactic acid. So we were talking about that, but foam rolling in particular for the IT band helps to stretch that fibrous connective tissue to help with swelling and inflammation of the legs from that use. Because as the muscles swell, if our iliotibial band doesn't expand to accommodate it, it can lead to displacement of the knee. It can lead to pain and discomfort, weakness, and things along the whole entire lateral aspect of the leg and the knee as a result of it. So you see many of the fascicles come straight across into that iliotibial band. This is significant because when we think of the function of this muscle is a posterior muscle, crosses the hip. So of course, what is its obvious action?
Extend.
Extend the hip. Remember, we always want to say what it's extending, either the joint or the part of the body. So extend the leg or extend the hip, absolutely. But because as it grabs and pulls that origin towards the insertion towards the origin, as it does, what other action is this muscle going to have? Laterally rotating the thigh, absolutely. We were talking about activities that can help us to remember this. When would you extend and adduct, pardon me, extend and laterally rotate the thigh?
So sit, folding one leg on another one.
Possibly, but again, remember, usually you have to flex the knee if you're going to do something like this. The one I always think of this, my children, when they were young, took dance class. And of course, being little girls, they took a ballet class. And when you're doing ballet class, there is, gosh, I don't even remember now, was it second position, something like that, first position? It's the one where you put your feet together. So you're standing up straight, you put your feet together and you turn your feet out. Is that first position? There you go, first position. When you're putting your feet out. If you notice, this is the muscle that would allow you to do that, right? You extend the legs and then you laterally rotate the feet and you're going to be in that first position. Excellent. So that gluteus maximus is going to allow you to get in that first position by extending your leg and laterally rotating the femur, laterally rotating your leg as a result of that. Now, as we've learned, anytime there is a maximus of something, there's going to be a minimus of something. That minimus isn't on your list of things you're responsible for, but there is a muscle in between, the gluteus medius. From this picture, it looks, and you can see that it is deep to the gluteus maximus. And you can also see it's superior to the gluteus maximus. But there's one other key to the gluteus medius. While the gluteus medius, the gluteus maximus is a posterior muscle, the gluteus medius is really a lateral muscle. And again, we see this really, really clearly when we look at its origin and its insertion. So let's do that. Notice for the gluteus medius, we need to look at a lateral view of the leg. And what is the origin of the gluteus medius? All right, the lateral surface of the ilium. Notice this fossa doesn't go up to the crest, but this big fossa here on the ilium, this is its origin. And being a lateral muscle, not surprisingly, it inserts into the lateralmost bone feature of the hip. And what was, of course, the lateralmost bone feature of the hip?
Trochanter.
The greater trochanter of the femur. Excellent. So there are its origins and its insertion. Now, being a lateral muscle that's crossing the hip, what do you think its most obvious action of a lateral muscle is? AB duct, absolutely. It's going to AB duct the leg.
Medially rotates.
Yep, there you go. But it doesn't line up perfectly, so it's going to medially rotate as well. So basically, again, if you pretend this was my leg, right, it's easier than standing up just pretending. It is going to AB duct it, and it is going to medially rotate it. It brings it inward. So basically, that would point the foot down, or your toes down, as you medially rotated that. All right, so those are the two actions of this. Notice one other thing, being a lateral muscle, it's a muscle that has a good bulk to it so that it could take a fair amount of bolus to it. It's well perfused, so it has the right amount of blood flow to it to distribute a medicine. And there are no large nerves in this location. Remember, as we were talking about, when you're giving someone an intramuscular injection, if it's in a movie, it's always in the butt. Right? Because it's way funnier when you do it into the butt, right? So that's always what's great on the movies. However, as we know, there's this big, huge opening, the greater sciatic notch, and our sciatic nerve comes out of this region. So when you're giving that intramuscular injection, they typically don't give it into the buttocks because there's that risk of hitting the nerve. Instead, this is a common location for that intramuscular injection. Basically, you find the person's iliac crest, right? You find their hip, you go down about 2 inches, and you do the injection there, right? In fact, we said the two most common muscles for an intramuscular injection are in an adult. It's different in kids because kids have smaller muscle masses. But in an adult, it's either the deltoid or it's the gluteus medius. So it's one of the common locations for that injection. All right. Questions on that?
Said one of the activities to remember, stand on your tip of toes or stand down. What did you say?
Well, so again, remember what this is doing. So I'll go ahead and demonstrate it. And again, you can figure out what this is, but it is abducting the leg and it is medially rotating the leg. So whatever you would use that for, that was the two actions. So you got to come up with an activity that would help you to remember those two. Does anybody have a good example of something that you would use that for?
Think of
A
when
ruddy
you're
kick.
bringing in
A
groceries.
roundhouse kick.
and
There you go.
like, stick your foot out to hold the door open behind you.
That is always the example I think of as well. The karate kicks are a great example of those. But again, for me, because, I've got kids and they're horrible, you're carrying in the big, huge bags of groceries and they go running in the house and they don't bother holding the door for you. So I always think of that same thing. You got the big, huge handful of groceries and you got to put your leg out to kind of hook the door to keep the door from closing so that you can bring it in. It's funny that you use that example. That's always the one I think of for something like this as well. Absolutely. So you're kind of kicking that leg out to grab and hook the door so that you can get the groceries into the house. That's awesome. All right. The leg is a location for a large number of muscle groups, and I'm going to hold you responsible for two of them. The first one you are responsible for is on the posterior side of the leg. And it is a muscle group called the hamstring. Anybody know why this is called the hamstring? Anyone have any idea? It's okay if you don't. I was just curious if someone might know. All right, excellent. Well, it turns out the anatomy of our knee is actually fairly similar to the anatomy of a pig's leg. Notice here on the back of our leg, there is this diamond-shaped region, which I've colored in nice and dark and black here. But notice now that it's highlighted, you can see where you can actually see the bone. There is this diamond-shaped region on the back of your knee that just has connective tissue and blood vessels in it. There's no actual muscle there. So there's actually a nice indentation that allows the leg to flex. It is formed inferiorly, by the two bellies. Oh, no, I don't want that. I want this. It is formed inferiorly by the two bellies of our calf muscle, the gastrocnemius, and it is formed superiorly by the three muscles of the hamstrings. So the three muscles of the hamstrings are here, and this is exactly what the anatomy of a pig's leg looks like. When you are butchering a pig for meat, the thigh is typically what is used for a ham, and that ham needs to be cured. So basically they take the meat hook, they put it in this diamond-shaped region that is called the popliteal fossa, and they hook it up into the muscle of the thigh so that they can hang it in the drying rack with the spices and everything on it to dry it and turn it into that ham. So it's literally where they string up the ham, string up the meat to be able to turn it and convert it into, cure it to become that ham. So that's why it's called the hamstring, because it's the meat where you go to make the ham. Now, notice there are three muscles, but one of those muscles is a special muscle. It is the bicep femoris. And what do we know about biceps?
Two head.
Two heads. So on one side of this hamstring, we have two muscles, the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. On the other side, we have one muscle, but that muscle has two heads. So we have the bicep femoris with its two heads on one side and two individual muscles, the semitendinosus and semimembranosus on the other side. So let's take a look at these. And remind me again, what are the rules for a muscle group?
There's two heads, so it should be long and short.
Well, no. For a muscle group, not for a multi-bellied muscle. When we have a muscle group, what are the keys to a definition of a muscle group? We have two or more muscles.
Same insertion point.
Careful, not necessarily an insertion point, but you've got the right idea. And again, remember, Allison, it doesn't have to be same. They have to be similar actions, but they don't have to be, oops, not sure what happened there. So two or more muscle groups, similar actions. They don't have to be identical, but similar actions. And they must share at least one attachment point. That attachment point can be the origin or it can be the insertion. Okay? And we'll see that when we look at these three muscles. Let's start first with the bicep femoris. For the bicep femoris, as the name would indicate, it has two heads. And how do we identify the two heads?
Long and short.
Long and short. Excellent. Just like the bicep brachia. So they're similar in that we have two heads, a long and a short head. However, it is different in their orientation. For our bicep femoris, for our bicep brachia, remember the two bellies were side by side. Long and a short head, the long was lateral and the short was medial. But let's look at these. What is the origin of the long head?
Skill tuberosity.
Excellent. So for the long head, the origin is up here on the ischial tuberosity, right? The butt bone. And what is the origin of the short head?
Linea aspera.
For the short head, remember it is that raised ridge on the posterior part of the femur. And where do both of these come together to insert? What is the insertion of both heads of the bicep femoris?
Common tendon into head of fibula and lateral condyle of tibia.
There you go. Over here on the lateral side. So notice if we were to draw these, let's draw the short head first. The short head is going to go from the linea aspera to the condyle, lateral condyle and head of the fibula. And then if we were to draw the long head, notice the long head basically sits right over the top of the short head. They cover each other up. In fact, I believe if we look at our classroom materials, there we go. Share screen. Under our lab handouts, there is leg models. And notice as we look at these leg models, let's take a look. Here we go. Perfect. This muscle right here we see from the posterior side. This is the short head of the bicep femoris. And where do we have? Do I have a picture? Oh, I like that. Do I not have one where it's intact? Oh, here we go. This is it there. So here is the long head sitting over the top. Notice we see a tiniest bit of the short head sticking out right here. So there is the short head and there is the long head of the bicep femoris over here on the lateral side of the leg. It sits right on top of it. And in fact, the best way to see the short head is actually to remove the long head. The long head normally sits right over the top of this. And so we only see a little bit of it peeking out. But if we remove it, we can see where it's actually originating from the linea aspera. So we can see that really, really nicely. Yes, with a multi-headed muscle, we consider all of the actions of it to be the same. Okay, so here we can actually see those. And that actually is a good point. When we come back to here, we see the same thing. So notice here again, we have the bicep femoris, and we really can't see the, sorry, here, this is a better view. So that bicep femoris is coming out laterally. Here we see it right here. And on top is the long head. And then just that teeny little bit sticking out along the side that we can see is the short head underneath it. So really the best way to see the short head is actually to remove the long head because the long head sits right on top of it. All right. Now let's go back real quickly to this, although I erased it. So now we'll have to draw them again. So our origins are the linea aspera and the ischial tuberosity. And our insertion is the lateral condyle of the tibia and the head of the fibula. So how many joints does this cross? Two, the hip and the knee. Now it is a posterior muscle. So what is the obvious action on the hip?
Extend.
It is a posterior muscle. What's the obvious action on the knee?
Extend, flex knee.
Flex. Remember, the knee is the one that goes backwards. So those are the two obvious actions, but notice it has a third action. And the reason it has a third action is because remember, this is coming from the lateral side. And coming from the lateral side, when it pulls the leg up, it is going to twist the leg. So as it pulls the insertion towards the origin from a posterior view, this is this right femur. And so this right femur is being rotated where the anterior surface is moving away from the midline. So its third action is going to be a lateral rotation. All right. Of the hip or the knee or the leg. We were talking about common activities. Can anybody think of a common activity where you might use this? I wouldn't say over, because the problem with bringing it over is, notice, and again, this is a little bit more challenging because we got to do this. Notice, to bring my leg over the other, I have to flex my hip. In this case, I need to extend my hip and bring it back. And I need to flex the knee. The example I always use for this, and again, I can't demonstrate it for you right now because it will kill me. But my oldest daughter, when she was really young, when she was like 3 or 4, when you would, she was very bouncy, would run around all the place. And so when you would tell her to sit down, you tell her to sit crisscross applesauce. What she would do is she would extend her leg, flex her knee, and she would laterally rotate. And notice when you laterally rotate it, you basically kick yourself in the back of the other knee. And so that's what she would do. She would kick herself in the back of the other knee, and she would collapse down into that crisscross applesauce position, right? And so that lateral rotation of the hip brings the foot into the back of the other one, and she'd kick herself in the back of the knee and sit down crisscross applesauce. So then that she was doing that, she was using her bicep femoris for that. All right. Questions on that? All right, let's do the origin of the semimembranosus. While we're here, this will be a perfect place to see this stuff. What is the origin of the semimembranosus? Come on, it's the last thing we're doing today. We're almost done.
Tuberosity.
Ischial tuberosity, excellent. Notice the same origin as the long head of the bicep femoris. It is a muscle group. It does need to share an attachment point. And where does it insert?
Proximal medial surface of tibia.
Yeah, basically underneath the condyle right here of our tibia. Notice not on the top of the condyle. That's where the knee joint forms. We don't want to put our muscles there. This is underneath. So we have this underneath there. That is that insertion. And so this muscle basically sits right here like this. All right. What muscle did I say that was?
Semimembranous.
Semimembranosus, excellent. What is the origin of the semitendinosus?
The same.
Same origin, same location. What is the insertion of the semitendinosus?
Medial surface instead of medial.
Yeah, basically the exact same place. Notice in this case, the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus essentially have the exact same origin and the exact same insertion. All right, we see that when we draw it, but we'll also see it when we look at the picture. Now, I don't want to switch to the picture yet because we'll lose our images here. Notice these two muscles, like the bicep femoris, all share the same origin. So that's why this is a muscle group. And being a posterior muscle, what effect does it have on the hip? What's the obvious effect on the hip?
Extends.
Extend the hip. What's the obvious action on the knee?
Flex.
Flex.
But notice this time it's angled medially. So when we again contract this muscle, we are going to pull the insertion towards the origin medially, and that is going to turn the femur so that the anterior part moves towards the midline. So what's our third action of both of these muscles?
Laterally.
Medial rotate the thigh.
Excellent. A medial rotation of the thigh. Perfect. So like we said, remember they have to be similar but not identical in their actions. But obviously the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus have the exact same origin, the exact same insertion. So it's not surprising they have the exact same actions. Does someone have an activity where we would extend the hip, flex the knee, and medially rotate the thigh?
When you have to pee and you're doing the potty dance, like holding.
Okay, excellent. The potty dance is definitely a good example of that. Again, back in ancient times, and by ancient times when I was in high school, basically when I was in high school, there were two groups, right? There were the groups that spent their breaks sitting out way off by the field, away from the quad, smoking pot. And there's the second group that were on the quad playing hacky sack, right? If you think about hacky sack, you have to have your hip extended, you have to have your knee flexed, and then when you immediately rotate, you can get your foot out there to kick that hacky sack, right? So you can kick that hacky sack because you were using the bicep, pardon me, not the bicep, the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. I don't know which one were the cool kids and which one were the not cool kids. All I know is that there were those two groups.
Question.
Yes.
So I was looking at the insertion for both of them. It states it a little differently, but can you say the medial condyle of the tibia for both of them?
Absolutely. And let's actually look, let's do this. Let's look at the actual model. Notice as we look at the model, oh, here's a perfect view. For this particular point, at this particular point, the basically inferior medial condyle of the tibia, there's not one, there's not two, there's not three, there are actually 4 muscles that all insert into this exact same location. Now notice, are they slightly offset from each other? Absolutely, but they're all basically in the exact same location, underneath that medial condyle of the tibia. So in fact, on the exam, if I gave you a bone that was a tibia, and again, because I'm such an amazing artist, let's draw it. There's the intercondylar eminence, and there's the tibia, and there's, of course, our medial malleolus. All right, there's my tibia. Oh, tibial tuberosity. There you go. Okay, that's horrible, but you get the idea. If I were to have a tibia and I were to label this bone feature and ask you to identify all the muscles that insert into it, you're going to have 4 answers. And 2 of them are the semimembranosus and the semitendinosus. And we actually see that here. This one right here on top is the semitendinosus. And this one right here underneath is the semimembranosus. And notice both of these are coming in to this exact same insertion point. So yes, I've worded them slightly differently, but on the exam, if you just want to say medial condyle of the tibia for all 4 of these insertions, I would be perfectly happy with that. All right. And that also brings us to, I need that posterior view. No. That one was not bad, but I don't have it. So let's do this. Let's see what Cosumnes River has. There we go. This works. Perfect. So here is the medial aspect of our leg. And again, as I mentioned, our semimembranosus and semitendinosus have the exact same origin and insertion. So one is just basically on top of the other. The semitendinosus, basically, and again, our model maker hasn't done a good job of showing us this, but not surprising, it gets its name by basically being half muscle and half tendon. Semitendinosus, it's half tendon. And it is the narrow one that is on top. So the semitendinosus is this narrow top muscle. Semitendinosus is on top. The semimembranosus is deep to it, but it's wider, it's broader. So notice we see a little bit of it sticking out here on this side, and we also see a little bit of it sticking out this side. So you have that broad semimembranosus, and then you have the narrow semitendinosus on top. So that's basically how they're oriented. Tendinosis on top, superficial. Membranosus is more medial because it's wider and it is deep. So these two muscles are right on top of each other, same origin, same insertion, same three actions, but one is superficial and one is deep. So we see it nicely here from this view. And remember, as we also talked about, when we look at this, so there you go, we see that there. When you look at it from the side, here, perfect, this is another great view of this as well. So notice again, we're looking at that posterior side the same. They've removed the gluteus maximus and they've rotated it slightly. So again, the tendinosis is on top. We see this here. And again, we see that little bit of the semimembranosus sticking out from underneath. Also, right here, we have the long head of the bicep femoris, and poking its head out just a little bit from right there is the short head of the bicep femoris. So here we see those four bellies, two individual muscles, semimembranosus, semitendinosus, long head of the bicep femoris, short head of the bicep femoris. These four bellies that collectively form our hamstring. And this is a nice view, nice superficial view of that hamstring muscle group. All right. Questions on that? All right, how are we on our list? Tell you what, I want to do two more muscles because while we're talking about the semimembranosus and semitendinosus, I don't want to do the next muscle group, but let's go back to this great picture. Oops. Was it my picture or was it their picture? I guess it was my picture. Okay, perfect. Here. Here we go. Excellent. Perfect. So, as I mentioned, there are four muscles that insert into the medial condyle of the tibia. The first is the semitendinosus, that muscle that is on top. The second is the semimembranosus, that muscle that is deep and underneath, but a little bit more medial, which is why we see it. And then these other two muscles right here, and this muscle right here. Let's talk about the one here we've drawn in purple. This muscle here in purple is the gracilis muscle. It is a medial muscle on the inside of the leg. It starts medial, it stays medial. Here we see it on our nice model. Starts medial, stays medial. Let's draw its origin and its insertion. There we go, this one here, perfect. It is going to originate from the medial most point it can down here on the leg. And not surprisingly, that is right here next to the pubic symphysis. It originates from the inferior angle of the pubis. Medial as it can get, because that pubic symphysis is right on the midline. And as we know, it inserts into the medial condyle of the tibia. So it starts medial, it ends medial, and we have this nice medial muscle on the medial aspect of the leg. Are we comfortable with that? All right, stunned silence, so I guess that means yes. Excellent. Now, obviously this, yeah, I appreciate it. This is the last thing I want to cover, but I want to make sure that we have enough because I want to cover as little as we need to on Monday. Crosses the hip, crosses the knee. All right, so basically what this is a strap-like muscle that basically is right here on the inside of the leg. So when it contracts, it basically collapses the leg and brings it inward. So notice its 4 actions are to flex the hip, flex the knee. Being medial, it adducts the leg, brings it in, and it is going to medially rotate it. Someone mentioned the PP dance earlier, right? This is probably a good example of where you might use this muscle. Although my favorite example, I had a student a few years ago who demonstrated for me what she called her fangirl dance, right? Her fangirl dance was this right here. Notice she is flexing her hip, flexing her knee, adducting her legs, and medially rotating them. So those are the 4 actions of the gracilis muscle. All right. It's this nice medial muscle, starts medial, ends medial on the medial aspect, superficial medial muscle of the leg. Now notice the last muscle is the sartorius. The sartorius is actually the longest muscle of the body. So again, for our gracilis, insert down here, originate up here, medial muscle. The sartorius also inserts here into the medial condyle, but as I mentioned, it is the longest muscle and it actually starts lateral. So it has a lateral origin. And in fact, if you're going to have a lateral origin and you're going to be the longest muscle, you need to start as high on the hip as you can. And so it originates from the superior anterior iliac spine. And basically what this muscle does is it comes down the leg and then wraps across and comes around this way. It's this long strap-like muscle that starts lateral and comes medial. We see it nicely on our illustration here. And notice on our bodybuilder. On our bodybuilder, we can actually see this muscle that is starting up here lateral and coming down, and we can see the strap where it is wrapping around to come in and insert here. Lastly, we see this nicely on the model as well. This nice strap-like muscle that starts lateral and comes around and inserts into that medial condyle. So we have our sartorius, we have our gracilis, our semimembranosus, and semitendinosus. All of these muscles that insert into basically the same place, the medial condyle of the tibia. Now, the sartorius is similar to the gracilis in that its job is to collapse the knee, collapse the leg. So if we look at our picture again, here, it is going to flex the hip. It is going to flex the knee, so it brings the leg up. But being a lateral muscle with a lateral origin, oops, that didn't work. It is going to adduct the leg, abduct, I'm sorry. Yeah, unfortunately it's gonna be gone, but I can do that. Abduct the leg, and it is going to laterally rotate it. So if you remember on the very first day, we talked about a muscle that flexes the hip, flexes the knee, abducts, and laterally rotates. This is the one that would cross your legs. Now, like I said, as I skip from these pictures, we lose the drawings, but let's go ahead and come here again. So again, the origin of the gracilis is the inferior angle. The origin of the sartorius is the superior anterior iliac spine. Both insert into the medial condyle. And again, the gracilis starts medial, stays medial, whereas the sartorius starts lateral and inserts medial. So there is the two muscles, and because they have different origins, they both flex the hip, they both flex the knee, but the sartorius brings it out and laterally rotates it. The gracilis brings it in and medially rotates it. So two similar actions, two different actions. All right. Is that what you wanted to see, Maxim? Excellent. All right. Any other questions on any of that? All right, I think that leaves us in a good place for our last day. We don't have too much lecture. We don't have too much. We're still a little behind where I'd like to be on the leg, but I think we have enough to get it all done. So we should be able to power through the rest of this on Monday. And like I said, we're getting through a lot of material, covering a lot of material that I know is overwhelming. But remember, you're going to have a whole week to synthesize this and make sense of it. So you'll have plenty of time with no new information to master this material. And I do indeed expect you to master it. All right. Questions on any of that? Excellent. And best part of all, with such a small group left, if again, we have a small group taking the exam, then I get them graded faster and you get the results back faster. So that could be a win-win all the way around. All right, excellent. You guys have a good week. This is it. Strong weekend. You only have 2 weekends left to prepare for this exam. So make sure this is one of them. Study hard, do your best, and I will see you in class on Monday. All right, take care. Have a good day.